Hey guys, tonight we are going to do something a little different. Instead of just talking about history, we're going to step through a quiet, paper-screened door into the past. We're heading back to 17th century Japan, the heart of the Takegoshi shogunate, to a city called Edo, the place that will one day become Tokyo. Now, this isn't a world of anime heroes. It's a place of rigid rules and subtle dangers. So if we were really there, you'd probably get into trouble for looking at a samurai the wrong way. A survival guide would be handy, but alas, we only have our imagination. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your city and the time in the comments below. It's always a quiet thrill to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice is the ground beneath your feet. It's not paved with stone, not like the grand cities of Europe you might have pictured. It's just packed, dark earth, still a little damp from a morning shower, and it muffles the sound of your steps. The air is a mix of smells: the clean, sharp scent of cedar wood from the tightly packed buildings, the savory aroma of grilling fish and soy sauce from a nearby food stall, and a faint, underlying hint of charcoal smoke and damp river mud. It's the smell of a city that is alive, a city made of wood, paper, and earth. You're standing on a bustling street, but it's a different kind of busy. There are no carriages rumbling by. Instead, the main sounds are human, the murmur of countless conversations you can't quite make out, the rhythmic clack, 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 clack of wooden sandals, or g'day, on the hard-packed ground, and the calls of merchants from their open front shops. The buildings huddle close together, most only 1 or 2 stories high, with dark, tiled roofs that curve upwards gently at the edges. Their walls aren't brick or stone, but a delicate-looking lattice of dark wooden translucent paper screens. It gives the whole city a feeling of being temporary, almost fragile. Then you see him, and the crowd subtly parts without a word. A samurai. You know it instantly. His head is shaved on top with the remaining hair oiled and tied into a stiff top knot. The Chan mage. He wears a formal, silver-colored kimono and a wide-sleeved jacket called a hori. But it's the 2 swords tucked into his belt, one long, one short, the daisho that command the space around him. His face is a mask of stern composure, his eyes looking forward, never meeting the gaze of the commoners who respectfully, almost instinctively, move aside. He is the walking, breathing embodiment of the era's power structure, the pinnacle of a 4-tiered social system. This is the mainstream image of feudal Japan, the warrior class, bound by honor, duty, and a terrifying amount of lethal privilege. But if you look past the samurai, you see the city's vibrant heart. A group of merchants in dark blue robes laugh loudly as they haggle over a price. A craftsman sits just inside his workshop, meticulously sanding a piece of wood. The sweet, dusty smell adding to the air. Children with shaved heads, save for a few tufts of hair, chase a dragonfly with a stick. Their laughter brightened carefree. These are the Chan, then. The townspeople, the merchants and artisans who technically sit below the samurai and farmers in the social hierarchy, but who are rapidly becoming the cultural and economic engine of this new, peaceful era. You notice something else, too. Perched atop a few of the taller roofs are wooden watchers. This brings to mind a curious and slightly grim detail of life in Edo. The city's construction of wooden paper made it a tinderbox. Fires were so common and so devastating that they were given a grimly poetic nickname, the Flowers of Edo. A small accident in a kitchen or a stray spark could, and often did, wipe out entire neighborhoods overnight. These watchers were the city's early warning system, a constant reminder that this bustling life could be turned to ash in a heartbeat. It's a strange, fatalistic acceptance of impermanence that seems to hang in the air right alongside the scent of cedar and soy. As you stand there, Taking it all in, you try to guess how many people live in this sprawling wooden city. 800,000, 500,000 in truth. You're likely standing in what was, for a time, the largest city on Earth. Historians estimate that by the early 1700s, Edo's population swelled to over 1 million souls, surpassing both London and Paris. And even that number is something scholars still quietly debate. Was Edo truly the largest? Or are the records simply better preserved? Some argue for an even higher count based on unofficial residents, while others are more conservative, pointing to the difficulty of an accurate census. It's one of those questions where history becomes a game of educated guesswork. As the day begins to fade, you see the samurai again, or perhaps another one just like him, disappearing down a narrow alley. You watch him go, an icon of perfect discipline, of a life governed by a strict code. But you can't help but feel a sense that beneath this flawlessly composed surface, there must be another world. A world of unfiltered emotion, of private desires, of things that can't be governed by a sword or a code of conduct. It's a world hidden behind those paper screens, and you have a feeling that's where the most interesting stories are waiting. Your feet carry you away from the main thoroughfare, down a quieter, more residential side street. The air here is calmer, the sounds more muted. You can hear the distant, rhythmic thud of a rice pounder and the faint, high-pitched notes of a stringed instrument, a shamisen, perhaps being practiced inexpertly behind a screen. This is the world of the samurai's daily life, a realm governed not by grand battles, but by an intricate web of social expectations. It's here you start to understand the immense pressure of their face-saving project, the constant performance of being a samurai. You stop before a modest but dignified samurai residence. It's not a castle, not by a long shot. It's a clean, orderly compound enclosed by a sturdy wooden wall with a heavy, gated entrance. The architecture is all about straight lines and dark, unadorned wood. There's a quiet severity to it, a sense of purposeful restraint. This is where the samurai you saw earlier might live, and his existence is defined by something called Bushido, the way of the warrior. You probably think of Bushido as an ancient, ironclad code of honor passed down through centuries. That's the popular image. Anyway, but here's a little secret: the romantic, formalized version of Bushido that most people know today was largely written down and idealized during the long peace of the Edo period itself. It was a way for a warrior class with no wars to fight to justify their continued existence at the top of the social ladder. Historians are still debating how much of this ancient code was a genuine rendition versus a clever bit of historical branding. It was less about battlefield conduct and more about creating a civilian rulebook for a ruling class. Their primary job was no longer fighting, but administration and, above all, setting a moral and aesthetic example for the lower classes. Inside that compound, every action is a reflection of one's honor and station. How you walk, how you bow, how you hold your chopsticks, even how you fold your clothes, it's all part of a performance. For the samurai, life was a stage, and the audience was everyone. A misspoken word, a clumsy gesture, a moment of emotional outburst. These weren't just personal failings, they were stains on the family name, cracks in the perfect facade of the warrior class. The pressure to maintain this stoic, unflappable demeanor must have been immense. You imagine the samurai from earlier returning home. He would be greeted by his wife and servants with deep, precise bows. He would slide off his sandals without a thought, his movements economical and practiced. Inside, the house would be clean, minimalist. The floors are covered in woven tatami mats. Their fresh, grassy smell a constant presence. The rooms are separated by sliding paper screens, or fusima, often painted with serene landscapes, a lone pine tree, a flight of cranes. It's a world of quiet, composed beauty, but it's also a world with very little privacy. A raised voice, a private argument, a moment of weakness, all could be heard through those thin paper walls. Here's a peculiar detail of this life. the importance of the Tukonomama. In the main reception room, there's an alcove, a recessed space that is the aesthetic and spiritual heart of the home. This is the Tukonoma. In it, you'd find a single, carefully chosen piece of art, a hanging scroll with calligraphy, or a painting under simple, elegant flower arrangement. Haikubena. The art would be changed with the seasons. It was a space for quiet contemplation, a testament to the samurai's refined taste and his connection to nature and art. It was another piece of the performance, showcasing his cultivation and sensitivity, qualities considered just as important as his martial skill in this peaceful era. He was expected to be both a warrior and a poet, but this relentless emphasis on honor and appearance had a dark side. Failure was not an option. A samurai who brought shame upon himself or his lord might be expected to perform seppuku, a ritualized form of suicide, to restore that lost honor. It's a grim concept, but it highlights the extreme lengths to which this face-saving project could go. The weight of this expectation that death was preferable to dishonor shaped every facet of their existence. As you stand there, picturing this life of rigid self-control, you start to see the cracks. Humans aren't built for such perfect, unyielding composure. There must be outlets. There have to be places where the mask can slip, where the rigid spine can relax, where the carefully controlled emotions desire, frustration, joy, sorrow can find a voice. The stoicism of the samurai class, this perfect face they presented to the world, wasn't the whole story. It was just the cover of the book, and it created a powerful vacuum, a deep, unspoken need for a world that operated on a completely different set of rules, a world where human feeling was a liability. But the commodity, the sun sets, and the paper lanterns begin to glow, casting a warm, soft light onto the dark street. The samurai's house is quiet, a bastion of respectable order. But you can feel it, that this is only one half of the city's soul. The other half is stirring to life somewhere else, in a place built not on honor, but on pleasure, and it's that other world that the samurai's carefully constructed identity secretly depends on. Your journey continues, and soon you find yourself a silent, invisible guest at a formal gathering. The air is thick with the scent of incense and the low murmur of polite, measured conversation. You're in the main hall of a powerful lord's residence, watching the final stages of a negotiation. But this isn't about land or grain taxes. It's about a marriage. On one side of the room sits the samurai you've been following, his face as impassive as ever. Beside him is his father, a stern-looking older man. Across from them sits another family, their status clearly equal. Then between them, like a beautiful, silent piece in a complex game of chess, sits the prospective bride. She is young, perhaps only 14 or 15, her face painted a stark, ceremonial white with a touch of red on her lips. She wears a stunningly elaborate kimono, a cascade of silk embroidered with auspicious symbols, cranes for long life, plum blossoms for perseverance. She has been trained for this moment her entire life, taught to move gracefully, to speak softly, and to show no emotion. Her gaze is lowered, fixed on the tatami mat before her. She doesn't speak. She is an object of appraisal, a vessel for a treaty. This is a meal, an arranged marriage meeting. Then what you're witnessing is the very foundation of samurai society. Love has absolutely nothing to do with it. Romance is a frivolous, even dangerous, concept in this world. A marriage is not the union of two individuals. It's a strategic alliance between two families. Its purpose is purely political and social. It's about consolidating power, securing allegiances, and, most importantly, ensuring the continuation of the family line. A good match could elevate a family's standing, while a bad one could lead to ruin. The personal feelings of the bride and groom are, at best, an afterthought. The fathers do all the talking. They speak of lineage, of dowries, of the bride's impeccable upbringing and her family's connections. They discuss the groom's prospects and his family's loyalty to their daimyo, their feudal lord. It's a transaction, pure and simple. The young woman is a key asset, her value measured by her pedigree, her health specifically, her perceived ability to bear children, and her family's influence. You watch the bride, trying to imagine what she must be thinking or feeling. Is she nervous, resigned, hopeful? It's impossible to tell. Her ask is as perfect as the groom's. She is a product of a system that prizes obedience and self-sacrifice above all else. From a young age, she would have been taught from a famous text called the Unnad Agaka, or the Great Learning for Women. This book, though its exact origins are debated by scholars, some say it was written by a male Neo-Confucian philosopher. Others argue it was a more organic compilation of social norms, laid out the 3 obediences for a woman as a child. She obeys her father as a wife. She obeys her husband and as a widow. She obeys her son. Her identity was entirely defined by her relationship to the men in her life. Here's a small but telling detail of the process: the exchange of gifts. It's not just a ring. The groom's family presents a list of symbolic gifts to the bride's family. These often included things like katsuo bush, dried bonito to symbolize masculine strength and virility, kamba seaweed because its name sounds like a word for a childbearing woman, and a folded paper fan, which represents a future that opens up with wealth and prosperity. Each item is a carefully chosen wish for the success of the union, a success measured in heirs and status, not happiness. Once the agreement is made, the deal is sealed. The wedding itself will be a Shinto ceremony, the quiet and solemn affair held at a shrine or within the groom's home. The highlight is the Sansenkudo, the 339 exchange of sake. The bride and groom each take 3 sips of sake from 3 different size cups. The numbers 3 and 9 are auspicious. This ritual exchange doesn't symbolize their love, it symbolizes the official binding of their 2 families. After the ceremony, the bride's life will change completely. She will leave her family's home and enter her husband's, where she will be under the authority of her mother-in-law. Her old life is over. As the meeting concludes, the families bow deeply to one another. The negotiation was a success. An alliance has been forged. Our samurai has a fiancée. He glances at her. Just for a moment, his expression unreadable. She does not look up. There is no spark, no hint of connection. There is only the quiet, formal acceptance of their roles. You can't help but feel a profound sense of melancholy. You've just witnessed the start of a lifelong partnership devoid of the one thing you might consider essential. It's a stark reminder that the concepts we hold dear, like marrying for love, are not universal truths. They are products of a specific time and culture. For the samurai of Edo, Japan, love was a luxury they couldn't afford. Or, more accurately, it was a sentiment that had to be sought elsewhere, in places far away from the sterile purity of the matrimonial home. The political marriage was the lock on the door of the samurai household, and it was a lock that would push its inhabitants to find other doors to open. The wedding ceremony is over. The bride, now a wife, has moved into her husband's family home. Her elaborate wedding kimono has been put away, replaced by the more subdued, practical robes of a married woman. Her world has shrunk to the confines of this walled compound, and her new life is one of routine, duty, and immense, unspoken pressure. You are now a silent observer within these paper-walled rooms, watching her navigate her new role. Her primary purpose, the very reason for her existence in this household, can be summed up in a single, all-important objective: producing a male heir. This is her key performance indicator, her KPI. Everything else is secondary. The family's name, its lineage, its very survival into the next generation rests squarely on her shoulders, or more accurately, in her womb. From the moment she steps into this house, the entire family, especially her mother-in-law, is watching and waiting. Her days are a long sequence of carefully prescribed duties. She rises before her husband, overseeing the servants as they prepare the morning meal. She ensures his clothes are immaculate, his swords polished, his daily needs met with quiet, efficient grace. She manages the household finances, supervises the staff, and tends to the needs of her husband's parents if they live with them. Her life is one of service, but woven through all these tasks is the constant, heavy expectation of pregnancy. Every month that passes without news is a silent failure. The relationship with her husband is formal and distant. They may share a sleeping space futons laid out on the tatami mats at night, but it is a space for procreation, not passion. There is no casual affection, no intimate conversation. In front of others, and even in private, they maintain a respectful distance. He is her ordained master, she is his dutiful subordinate. The rigid hierarchy of the outside world is perfectly replicated within the home. You watch her one afternoon, kneeling in a quiet room, practicing calligraphy. Her brush moves with fluid, controlled strokes, creating beautiful characters on the delicate rice paper. This is one of a married woman's few acceptable pastimes, along with flower arranging or playing the koto, the lon, string zither. These pursuits were encouraged not for her personal fulfillment, but because they demonstrated refinement and discipline, qualities that reflected well on her husband and his family. They were an extension of her role as a tasteful household manager. Here's a curious piece of social etiquette that governed her life. A samurai wife was not supposed to show jealousy. It was considered a deeply unbecoming, disruptive emotion. The unnod Agaka explicitly warned against it. If her husband sought companionship elsewhere, and he was largely expected to, she was to accept it with quiet dignity. To show anger or sadness would be a breach of decorum, a sign that she was putting her own selfish feelings above the harmony of the household and her husband's happiness. It was a brutal standard of self-abnegation, demanding she erase her own emotional needs for the sake of appearances. Historians are still piecing together the true emotional lives of these women from the limited sources available, like personal diaries or letters. While the official conduct books paint a picture of stoic submission, these rare personal accounts sometimes reveal glimpses of deep loneliness, frustration, and even quiet acts of rebellion. The question of how much these women really internalized this ideology versus how much they were simply performing a role for survival is a subject of ongoing academic discussion. Did they genuinely believe in their subservient role, or did they harbor a rich, secret inner life of their own? If she fails to produce an heir after a few years, the pressure becomes unbearable. The family might start to whisper about her being barren. The ultimate humiliation would be for her husband to take a concubine, an officially recognized secondary partner whose sole purpose would be to succeed where she had failed. A concubine would typically be of a lower social standing, so her son would not have the same prestige as one from the official wife, but he could still be named the heir. The wife would have to accept the concubine into her household and treat her with a semblance of civility. The presence of this other woman would be a daily, public reminder of her own perceived inadequacy. In the worst-case scenario, if she failed to produce a son and a suitable concubine couldn't be found, her husband's family could simply divorce her. The process was brutally simple. Her husband would just write a short letter of dismissal, the Miku Derihan, and send her back to her family in disgrace. She would have no say in the matter. So you watch this young woman, trapped in a gilded cage. She is surrounded by beauty, the serene heart, the elegant gardens, the fine silks, but it is a cold, demanding beauty. Her worth is tied to her fertility. Her happiness is irrelevant, and her future depends on her ability to fulfill a single, biological imperative. It is a life of immense privilege and immense sacrifice. And as she kneels there, her face a perfect, placid mask, you understand that the strictures of the samurai code were just as binding for its women as for its men, if not more so. The system that gave her husband his honor demanded her complete and total submission. Now, let's leave the wife to her quiet, orderly world of household duties then turn our attention back to her husband. The same rigid system that confines her to the home grants him a startling degree of freedom. Once he has fulfilled his duty by marrying a suitable woman from a good family, society implicitly looks the other way as he seeks emotional, intellectual, and physical satisfaction elsewhere. It's a glaring double standard, but one that was woven into the very fabric of samurai life. You follow the samurai as he leaves his compound for the evening. He has finished his administrative duties for the day, a monotonous task of reviewing documents and attending formal meetings. His face, which was a mask of stern responsibility at home, begins to soften almost imperceptibly as he walks through the darkening streets of Edo. HES not heading to a military barracks or a training dojo. HES heading towards a different kind of world, one where the rules of honor and restraint are temporarily suspended. This freedom was not just a matter of personal indiscretion, it was a socially sanctioned outlet. The Neo-Confucian ideals that governed the samurai household were understood to be incredibly restricted. The political marriage was a necessity for social order, but everyone knew it was emotionally sterile. Therefore, a man, especially a man of the samurai class, needed a place to unwind, to experience the more human aspects of life, witty conversation, artistic beauty, romantic flirtation, and physical intimacy. These things were considered incompatible with the pure, functional environment of his home. So, where is he going? His destination is likely a place within the burgeoning entertainment districts of the city. These were areas where the strict social hierarchy could become a little blurry, where merchants with new money could rub shoulders with samurai who had status but perhaps less cash. It's in these districts that he could find the companionship his wife was forbidden from providing. One of the fascinating, and perhaps frustrating, aspects of this system is how compartmentalized it was. The samurai's life was split into two distinct spheres. The first was the world of omori, the front or public-facing world of duty, honor, and family. This was his home, his lord's castle, his official life. The second was the world of okayu or uchi, the inner or private sphere, but this term is tricky. While it could refer to the inner parts of his home, it also extended to his personal, private pleasures, which were often found far from it. He could be a stoic patriarch in one world and a passionate patron of the arts and a lover in another. The key was to never let the two worlds mix. A bizarre bit of trivia from this era is the existence of guides and directories for these entertainment quarters. These weren't CD, back alley pamphlets. They were often beautifully printed wood block books, updated annually, that reviewed and ranked the most famous courtesans, detailed the protocols of the pleasure districts, and even offered fashion advice for prospective clients. They were the Michelin guides of their day for the world of sensual indulgence. A samurai planning a night out could literally consult a guidebook to choose his companion for the evening, much like someone today might read a restaurant review. The official wife was for procreation and household management. The other woman, whether she was a high-ranking courtesan or a long-term mistress, was for everything else. This other relationship could be deeply emotional and intellectually stimulating. Here, he could discuss poetry, politics discreetly. Of course, with art, he could laugh, be vulnerable, and experience a level of intimacy that was simply unthinkable with his own wife. Historians often debate the true nature of these extramarital relationships. Were they purely transactional, a simple purchase of services, or did genuine love and deep emotional bonds often form the evidence found in diaries, letters, and even popular fiction of the time? Suggests it was a complex mix of both. Some men undoubtedly saw it as a mere pastime, but many others formed lasting attachments, spending vast sums of money to maintain relationships with their favorite courtesans or mistresses, sometimes for years on end. These relationships, existing completely outside the bounds of marital duty, were often the most significant romantic connections in a man's life. As you watch the samurai disappear into the vibrant, lantern-lit entrance of an entertainment district, you realize the profound hypocrisy of the system. The very honor code that demanded his wife's absolute fidelity and emotional suppression not only permitted but practically encouraged his own infidelity. Her confinement was the price of his freedom. His ability to maintain his face as a stoic warrior bureaucrat was enabled by the existence of a world where he could, for a price, take that mask off. The entire social structure was built on this contradiction. The purity of the home was protected by outsourcing impurity to a designated, carefully controlled part of the city. The stability of the samurai family was maintained by allowing the man of the house to find his emotional and physical release elsewhere. It was a delicate and deeply unequal balancing act. The quiet, respectable samurai home and the noisy, glittering pleasure quarter were two sides of the same coin, each one necessary for the other to exist. And it is into that glittering, complicated world that we are about to follow him. You follow the samurai, your silent footsteps tracing his path away from the somber, orderly world of his class and into something entirely different. The streets become more crowded, more chaotic. The lanterns glow brighter here, casting a warm, inviting, and slightly mischievous light on the faces of the people thronging the alleyways. The air changes, too. It's heavier, scented with sweet perfume, sake, and the tantalizing aroma of street food meant to be eaten on the move. The restrained murmur of the samurai districts has been replaced by a boisterous symphony of laughter, music, and excited chatter. You have arrived at the gateway to the Yokio, the floating world. This term, Yokio-e, is one of the most evocative concepts from Edo, Japan. Originally, it was a Buddhist term with a rather gloomy, meaning the saddened, sorrowful world of transient, earthly existence. But during the long peace of the Edo period, the prosperous townspeople cheekily repurposed it. They changed the character for Sadyo to one that meant to float full. So, the sorrowful world became the floating world. It was a brilliant piece of cultural rebranding. The idea was to stop worrying about the transient nature of life and instead embrace it. If life is just a fleeting dream, why not make it a beautiful, pleasurable one? The floating world wasn't a single physical place, but a mindset, a subculture dedicated to the pursuit of style, entertainment, and sensual pleasure. It was the pop culture of its day. Its centers were the kabuki theaters, the sumo wrestling arenas, and, most notoriously, the licensed pleasure quarters. It was a world where the rigid social hierarchy, for a moment, seemed to dissolve. Hyo, a wealthy merchant, technically at the bottom of the Neo-Confucian ladder, could outspend endowed stylist at a rich but cash-poor samurai. Money, taste, and wit were the currencies that mattered here, not birthright. As you walk, you're immersed in the aesthetics of the floating world. The kimonos are brighter, the patterns bolder. Men and women alike are dressed in the height of fashion, their robes and hairstyles reflecting the latest trends, often set by famous kabuki actors or high-ranking courtesans. These celebrities were the influencers of their day, their styles copied by legions of fans. You see a group of young men, probably the sons of rich merchants, swaggering down the street. Their hair is meticulously styled. Their robes are a daring shade of purple, and they laugh with a confidence that borders on arrogance. They are the living embodiment of Ikei, a key aesthetic of the floating world. Ikei is a difficult word to translate. It's a kind of effortless chic, a sophisticated, understated elegance mixed with a hint of raguish allure. It's about being worldly, stylish, and a little bit dangerous, but never vulgar or flashy. It was the ultimate compliment to be called Ikei. It meant you knew the rules of the game. You had impeccable taste, and you wore your worldliness with a light, confident touch. Our samurai, in his sober, formal attire, looks almost out of place here, but he is drawn to it all the same. This is the world that offers everything his own lacks. A fascinating cold fact about the floating world is its deep connection to the publishing industry. The insatiable appetite for entertainment fueled a massive boom in woodblock printing. People wanted pictures of their favorite actors, yakusha ii, beautiful women bichinga, and scenes from famous plays. They also devoured cheap, illustrated novels Kibiyoshi that satirized contemporary society and celebrity gossip. It was a vibrant, commercially driven media ecosystem, not unlike our own. The floating world wasn't just experienced, it was consumed, collected, and endlessly discussed. Historians often emphasize that the floating world was a crucial safety valve for Edo society. The Takugoja shogunate imposed a rigid, authoritarian system, but they were pragmatic enough to understand that people needed a place to blow off steam. By confining the more disruptive elements of human nature, gambling, ostentatious fashion, and commercialized sex to specific, licensed districts, they could both control and profit from them through taxes. It was a clever strategy of containment. They created a fantasy world where the rules were different, allowing people to escape their daily reality, but ensuring that this escape happened within a carefully managed and policed environment. You watch as the samurai pauses by a stall selling woodblock prints. He picks one up, a portrait of a famous kabuki actor in a dramatic pose. His face remains impassive, but his eyes linger on the bold lines and vibrant colors. For a moment, he is just another consumer of culture, another soul drawn in by the glamour of this world. The two swords at his waist seem like relics from another reality. The floating world represents a fundamental contradiction of the Edo period. It was a society that officially venerated austerity, duty, and self-denial, yet it simultaneously cultivated one of the most hedonistic and aesthetically obsessed urban cultures the world had ever seen. Scholars still debate the true meaning of this duality. Was the floating world a form of cultural resistance, a silent rebellion by the merchant class against the samurai's dominance, or was it simply a necessary illusion, a fantasy theme park created by the authorities to keep the population docile and entertained? Perhaps the truth, as it often is, lies somewhere in between. The path ahead of you narrows, and the noise level rises. You see a massive, imposing gate at the end of the street, flanked by guards. This is not just another part of the entertainment district. This is the entrance to a specific, infamous precinct within the floating world. It's a place with its own rules, its own government, and its own magic, glittering allure. This is the gateway to Yoshiwara. You pass through the great gate, and the world outside seems to fall away. The air inside feels different, heavier with perfume and unspoken rules. You have just crossed the threshold into Yoshiwara, the most famous and infamous yukaku, or licensed pleasure quarter, in all of Japan. This isn't just a neighborhood, it's a walled city within the city of Edo, a self-contained world operating on its own clock and its own logic. As you step onto its main thoroughfare, Nakano-cho, you understand why it was nicknamed the Nightless City. Rows of lanterns hang from every building, casting a perpetual, dreamy twilight over the street, making it impossible to tell if it's dusk or deep in the night. The first thing that strikes you is the sheer, overwhelming spectacle. The buildings are grander here than in the rest of Edo. They are 2 or 3 stories tall, with intricate wooden latticework covering their facades. These are the tea houses and the houses of assignation, known as Agia, but it's the main brothels, the maze, that truly take your breath away. Their entire ground floors are open to the street, but barred with a wooden lattice, like beautiful, ornate cages, and inside these cages, on display, are women. They are the lower-ranking courtesans, the hashijei oro. They sit on a tiered platform, dressed in vibrant, colorful kimonos, their faces painted a uniform, mask-like white. They are arranged for viewing, silent and still, like dolls in a shop window. Men, potential customers, stroll slowly up and down the street, peering through the lattice, assessing the merchandise. The practice was called harimise. It is a stark, brutal, and deeply objectifying introduction to the reality of Yoshiwara. There is no pretense here these women's bodies are for sale. Yoshiwara was established in the early 17th century by the Tokugawa shogunate. Its creation was a masterstroke of social engineering. The government understood that it couldn't simply outlaw prostitution, so it decided to control it. By confining it to a single, walled-off district, they could regulate it, tax it, and keep an eye on it. The original Yoshiwara was located near the center of Edo. But after the Great Fire of 1657, one of those flowers of Edo, it was moved to a more remote location on the city's outskirts, surrounded by a moat. There is only one way in and one way out the great gate you just passed through. This design wasn't just for dramatic effect. It was to ensure no one, especially the women inside, could leave without permission. As you walk deeper into the district, you notice the carefully manicured cherry trees lining the central avenue. In spring, their blossoms would create a canopy of breathtaking, transient beauty. This was intentional. Everything in Yoshiwara was designed to create an atmosphere of fantasy and escape. It was meant to be a dream world, a beautiful illusion that distracted from the grim reality of its existence. The beauty was a carefully constructed facade to make the commerce palatable. Here's a rather sad and bizarre fact about life in Yoshiwara. The women who lived and worked here were, for all intents and purposes, prisoners. Many were sold to the brothels as young girls, often by impoverished rural families, under a contract of indenture that could last 10 years or more. They accumulated debt for their food, lodging, and extravagant clothing, a debt that was almost impossible to repay. The dream was to be ransomed by a wealthy patron who would buy out their contract and make them his wife or mistress. But this was a rare, fairy tale ending. For most, Yoshiwara was a life sentence. They couldn't leave the district's walls without a special pass, and trying to escape was a serious crime, punishable by severe beatings or worse. Historians debate the extent to which the women of Yoshiwara were victims or agents in their own lives. The dominant narrative, rightly, focuses on the exploitation and bondage. They were sold, trapped, and their bodies commodified. However, some revisionist scholars, looking at the intricate culture and hierarchies within Yoshiwara, argue that to see them only as passive victims is to deny them their complexity. The most successful courtesans wielded a strange kind of power. They were cultural trendsetters, accomplished artists, and witty conversationalists who could captivate the most powerful men in Japan. They learned to navigate their gilded cages with skill and intelligence, creating a unique and powerful subculture. This doesn't negate their bondage, but it adds a layer of nuance to their story. Our samurai moves through this world with a practiced ease. He ignores the caged displays of the lower-ranking women. His destination is one of the more exclusive establishments, a place where business is conducted with far more subtlety and decorum. He enters a high-end tea house, which acts as a sophisticated middleman. You don't just walk into a top-tier brothel and pick a woman. The entire process is mediated through these tea houses, which handle the arrangements, the payments, and the delicate social rituals involved in meeting a high-ranking courtesan. The atmosphere in the tea house is one of hushed elegance. The samurai is greeted with deep bows and lead to a private room overlooking a small, serene garden. Here, he will wait. He is not just buying sex, he is buying an experience. He is buying time, beauty, art, and the illusion of romance. The night has just begun, and the rituals of the nightless city are slowly unfolding, layer by intricate layer. The reality of Yoshiwara is a heartbreaking mix of glamour and exploitation, ardent commerce, fantasy, and a very hard, cold reality. Inside the refined tea house, the samurai waits. The transaction he is about to engage in is far more complex than a simple purchase. He is seeking an audience with a high-ranking courtesan, and to do so, he must navigate a steep and treacherous social ladder, one as rigid as the samurai hierarchy itself. You are about to witness the intricate class system that existed within the walls of Yoshiwara, a microcosm of the society outside, but with its own unique and daft, uncruel logic. The women of Yoshiwara were not all equal. Their world was a pyramid. At the very bottom were the women you saw in the latticed cages. The Hashi J-Oro or Mise J-Oro. They were the most numerous and the most exploited, with little to no autonomy. Above them were several intermediate ranks, women who had perhaps a bit more freedom to refuse a client, but who were still largely anonymous figures in the grand scheme of the floating world. But at the very top of this pyramid, shining like distant, unattainable stars, were the Edo-era, and at the absolute apex, the Teiyu. These were the supermodels, celebrities, and cultural icons of their time. They were not just women who sold intimacy, they were highly accomplished artists and entertainers. A true Edo-era was expected to be proficient in a wide range of traditional arts. She could play musical instruments like the shinsen and koto. She could sing. She was a graceful dancer. She could compose poetry. And she was a master of calligraphy and the intricate rituals of the tea ceremony. She was also expected to be a witty, intelligent, and engaging conversationalist. The training for this role began in childhood. A girl destined to become a top courtesan would be brought to Yoshiwara around the age of 5 to 7. She would start as a keimuro, a young attendant to an established Edo-era. As a keimuro, she would learn by observing, absorbing the etiquette, the artistic skills, and the sophisticated manner of speech required for the profession. Her life was a long, grueling apprenticeship. Once she came of age, she would graduate to the rank of shinzo, a kind of apprentice, as courtesan, before finally making her debut. This latter wasn't just about skill, it was about status and presentation. The higher a courtesan's rank, the more elaborate her costume. An Edo-era on parade wore dozens of layers of silk kimono, weighing upwards of 20 kilograms, about 45 pounds. Her hair was an elaborate, heavy construction, held in place with numerous, expensive hairpins made of tortoiseshell, silver, burkura. A particularly strange and iconic part of her attire was her footwear, towering, black lacquered wooden clogs, called komagere or mitsu, as high that could be over 20 centimeters 8 inches tall. Walking in these required a specific, stylized figure 8 gait, and she needed the help of attendants just to move. Her costume was a beautiful prison, a physical representation of her high status and her lack of freedom. The term Edo-era, which became common in the mid-Edo period, is itself quite interesting. It is said to have originated from the phrase Oira no Tokoro no Nes, Dan, which roughly translates to the older sister in my place. It was a term used by the younger attendants to refer to the star courtesans. It suggests a strange kind of S or oral hierarchy within the brothel houses. So, how does our samurai get to meet such a woman? He can't just request her. The process was a ritualized courtship that could take 3 meetings and a small fortune. On the first meeting, the shoke, the Edo-era would be summoned to the tea house. She would enter the room, but she would sit far away from the client, would not speak to him, eat, or drink. She would simply observe him from a distance, judging his character, his wealth, and his status. The client, meanwhile, was expected to put on a lavish display, ordering expensive food and drink and entertainment from other performers to demonstrate his worthiness. He was, in essence, auditioning for her. If he was deemed acceptable, he could request a second meeting. This time, she might sit a little closer, but the formal distance was largely maintained. Only on the third meeting, if the client had proven his wealth, sophistication, and good manners, would he finally be accepted as a patron. From then on, he would be given a special bowl and chopsticks bearing his name, kept at the house for his exclusive use. Only then, after this elaborate and expensive courtship, would true intimacy be a possibility. The Edo-era had the right to refuse a client. Even after all this, if she found him boorish or otherwise unacceptable. This power of refusal was one of the few, but significant, levers of control she possessed. Scholars continue to analyze the power dynamics of this relationship. On one hand, the Edo-era was an enslaved person, her body a commodity. On the other, she wielded immense social and cultural power within her limited sphere, capable of bankrupting men and dictating cultural trends. Was her power real, or was it just another part of the fantasy? A clever marketing trick to make the transaction more alluring and exclusive? The answer is likely both. Her power was a performance, but it was a performance so convincing that it became a reality within the walls of Yoshiwara. Our samurai understands this game. He has the money and the status. He has made the necessary arrangements through the tea house. And now, he waits for the rustle of silk that will announce the arrival of the star he has paid so dearly to see. The faint, rhythmic sound of wooden clogs on the polished floor grows louder, and the paper screen slides open. But it's not the Edo-era who enters. First, her two young Kai-amuro attendants, dressed in matching crimson kimonos, scurry in on kneel. Then, a male attendant, the wakaimono, steps aside, holding the screen. Then finally, she appears, and you have to hold your breath. You are no longer just imagining a historical curiosity. You are witnessing an Edo-era on Duchu, the formal procession of a high-ranking courtesan, albeit a small, indoor version of it. This is the spectacle that commoners would line the streets of Yoshiwara to witness. When a top Edo-era was summoned by a wealthy patron, she didn't just walk from her brothel to the designated tea house. She paraded. It was a piece of mobile theater, a public declaration of her status and the wealth of the client who had summoned her. The street became her runway, and everyone stopped to watch. The woman who stands in the doorway is a living work of art. Her face is a perfect oval of white paste. Her eyebrows are faint smudges high on her forehead, and her lips are painted in a small, perfect red pout. Her kimono is a breathtaking masterpiece of scarlet silk, heavily embroidered with gold and silver thread depicting auspicious cranes in flight. The outer robe, the uchikake, is left open to reveal at least half a dozen more layers of contrasting silks beneath. The sheer weight of it all seems impossible. Her stash, or obi, is not tied in the back like a respectable woman's, but in the front, in a large, complex knot, the unmistakable sign of her profession. Her hair is even more astonishing. It's a vast, complicated architecture of lacquered black hair, shaped into wide, projecting wings and decorated with a dazzling array of hairpins. You can see long, flat pins of tortoiseshell, delicate floral ornaments called kanzashi, and even what look like strands of coral. It's a crown of unimaginable complexity and weight. One can only imagine the strain on her neck. But the most iconic element is her movement. Supported by her attendant, she takes a single step into the room. She is wearing the impossibly high, black lacquered clothes, the komagere. To walk in them, she has to swing her leg out in a slow, deliberate semicircle, a stylized, gliding motion known as the Hachimonji gait, or figure-8 walk. Each step is a performance. It is mesmerizing, unnatural, and deeply symbolic. She is not a normal woman, she is a celestial being, moving in a way that no one else does. The difficulty and artistry of this walk were part of her allure. A strange and little-known fact about the Edo-era on procession is the sheer manpower it required. A full outdoor Dutu was a major production. It would include not just her, Kai-amuro, and a male attendant to help her walk, but also a man to hold a large, elegant paper umbrella over her head. Regardless of the weather, there would be lantern bearers, and perhaps even musicians. It was her entourage, her court, and all of it was paid for by the client. The procession was as much a display of his wealth as it was of her beauty. Her samurai rises and bows deeply. She does not return the bow but gives a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Her attendants guide her to the seat of honor, Furthest from the door, she settles onto her cushion with a quiet trestle of silk. Her movements slow and deliberate, as if every gesture has been rehearsed 1,000 times. She is the queen of this small room, and he is her subject. The power dynamic is palpable. In the world outside, he is the samurai, a member of the ruling class. He could, in theory, cut a man down for a perceived insult. But in here, in this room, the roles are reversed. He is the supplicant. He must impress her, entertain her, and defer to her. Her silence is her power. She will not speak until she is ready. The pressure is on him to be witty, sophisticated, and, above all, interesting enough to earn her attention. Historians have long been fascinated by this inversion of power. Some see it as a purely commercial performance, the ultimate hard-to-get routine, designed to drive up the price and make the final conquest more satisfying for the client. Others argue that it reflects a deeper cultural truth about the nature of love and desire in Edo Japan. In the formal world of samurai marriage, the man was the undisputed master. But in the floating world, the world of emotion and passion, the woman, or at least the idealized image of a woman embodied by the Oira, held all the cards. She was the gatekeeper to a world of feeling that he was denied elsewhere. The samurai begins to speak, his voice low and formal. He might comment on the seasonal flower arrangement in the corner or the painting on the hanging scroll. He is demonstrating his aesthetics and sensitivity, proving that he is a man of culture, not just a warrior. She listens, her face a beautiful, inscrutable mask. Her gaze is distant, as if her thoughts are 1,000,000 miles away. She is in complete control. You realize that this spectacle, this breathtaking display of beauty and power, is built on a foundation of profound sorrow. This woman's artistry, her status, her very identity, have been forged in captivity. She is the most glamorous prisoner in Edo, a beautiful bird in a magnificent cage. The procession that awaits the crowds is also a constant reminder of the world she cannot enter, and the clogs that elevate her also prevent her from ever walking freely. The queenly or she projects is both her triumph and her tragedy. The air in the private room is thick with unspoken calculations. The Oira sits like a statue carved from silk and porcelain, while the samurai, for all his status, is essentially on trial. Now, you begin to grasp the sheer, mind-boggling expense of this entire ritual. This is not a transaction for the faint of heart or light of purse. Spending a night in Yoshiwara, especially with a top-ranking courtesan, was an economic undertaking of epic proportions. Let's try to put it in perspective. The basic unit of currency for a large part of the Edo period was the koku of rice, enough rice to feed one person for 1 year. A samurai's wealth and stipend were measured in kokoku. A lower-ranking samurai might have a stipend of less than 100 koku, while a powerful daimyo might control a domain worth hundreds of thousands. The average cost for a single night with a top teiyu or oiran could be several yoyoyo, a gold coin of significant value. To give you a rough idea, 1 yoyo was, at times, roughly equivalent to 1 koku of rice. So, a single evening could cost the equivalent of a person's entire food supply for a year, or more. But the courtesan's fee was just the beginning. It was the tip of a very expensive iceberg. As you watch the scene unfold, you see the other costs piling up. The samurai had to pay the tea house, the eija, for the use of the room. He had to pay for the lavish meal being served, course after delicate course, and the endless flasks of high-quality sake. He had to pay for the entertainment. Perhaps a geisha is summoned to play the shamisen and sing, or a male jester, the takomaki, is brought in to tell jokes and lighten the mood. All of these performers needed to be paid. Then there were the tips. You had to tip everyone. You tipped the tea house proprietor, the servers, the courtesan's male attendant, her young kayamaro, who would receive special little gifts or packets of money, and even the people who cleaned the rooms. These tips, or shogai, were not optional. They were a crucial part of the system, a way of displaying your wealth and generosity. Failing to tip appropriately would mark you as a country bumpkin, a man without IKI, and you would likely never be welcomed back. And remember the oiran duchu, the procession the client paid for that too. The cost of her entire entourage, from the umbrella holder to the lantern bearers, was added to his bill. If he wanted to be seen as a man of substance, he had to spring for the full, glorious production. One of the weirdest and most fascinating parts of this economy was the concept of the najimi. A najimi was a regular, established patron. Becoming a najimi required the incredibly expensive 3-visit courtship ritual we've discussed. Only after becoming a najimi did the real relationship and the real spending begin. Patrons were expected to shower their favorite courtesan with gifts, exquisite kimonos, expensive hair ornaments, and other luxury goods. These weren't just tokens of affection, they were public statements of the patron's wealth and the courtesan's desirability. A popular oiran would have multiple najimi competing for her attention, a rivalry that the brothel owners were more than happy to encourage. It's a system that seems almost designed to bankrupt its participants, and often it did. There are countless stories from the period, both real and fictional, of wealthy merchants and even high-ranking samurai who ruined their families and lost their fortunes chasing after a celebrated courtesan. This financial ruin was so common that a special term for it existed, kaisekai, which means buying a castle toppler, with castle toppler being a poetic metaphor for a courtesan so alluring she could bring down a powerful man's domain. Historians are still trying to map the precise economic flows of Yoshiwara, and it's a fiendishly complex task. The accounting was opaque, with many transactions happening off the books. The question of where all this money actually went is a matter of some debate. The brothel owner, the loju aishu, took the largest cut. Of course, the tea houses took their share. The courtesan herself would receive a portion, but it was often immediately swallowed up by the debt she owed for her extravagant kimonos and living expenses. The system was structured to keep the women in perpetual bondage, no matter how much revenue they generated. Looking at the samurai in the room, you wonder how he can afford it. Perhaps he is from a very wealthy family, or perhaps he is spending far beyond his means, risking his future for this one night of fantasy. He has to project an air of nonchalant generosity, as if this colossal expense is nothing to him. Any sign of concern about the cost would be the height of vulgarity. The whole encounter is a performance of wealth. The oiran's performance of art and allure is matched by the client's performance of financial power. He is not just buying her time, he is buying the right to participate in this exclusive, high-stakes game. The price of admission was designed to be ruinously high, precisely to keep the riff-raff out and to make the experience feel like the ultimate luxury in the floating world. You weren't just what you were, or what you said you were, what you could afford to waste. And a night with an oiran was the most beautiful and most dangerous waste of money imaginable. As the evening wears on, the atmosphere in the room remains formal, almost stiff. The oiran is a master of ceremony, but she is not a solo performer. To fill the quiet spaces and to add another layer of artistry and entertainment to the evening, another figure is summoned. The paper screen slides open again, and a woman enters. She is also dressed in a beautiful silk kimono, her face painted white, her hair impeccably styled, but there is a subtle, crucial difference in her presentation. Her obi, the wide sash, is tied in the back in a simple, flat knot. She carries a shamisen, a 3-stringed lute, in her hands. This is a geisha. And here, we need to pause and clear up one of the most persistent and widespread misunderstandings about Japanese culture. The word geisha is often used, especially in the West, as a synonym for a high-class prostitute. This is fundamentally incorrect. The geisha and the oiran were two entirely different professions. and confusing them would have been a serious social gaffe in Edo, Japan. The word geisha yunja literally means person of the arts. Their job was exactly that, to entertain with their artistic talents. A geisha was a highly trained professional musician, singer, and dancer. She was also a skilled conversationalist, able to engage clients on a range of subjects, tell jokes, and facilitate a light, convivial atmosphere. She was, in essence, the life of the party. Her role was to entertain guests at banquets and parties, which often took place in the very same tea houses where one might meet an oiran. But her services were strictly artistic and social. She did not sell sex. The geisha in the room kneels gracefully, tunes her shamisen, and begins to play. The music is lively and evocative, a fast-paced tune that tells a story from a popular play. Her fingers fly across the strings, and as she plays, she sings in a clear, high voice. Her presence instantly changes the dynamic of the room. The heavy, formal atmosphere lightens. The samurai smiles, tapping his fan in time with the music. Even the oiran seems to relax slightly, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. The geisha is the social lubricant, the catalyst for enjoyment. The origin of the geisha profession is itself a fascinating story. In the early days of the pleasure quarters, the entertainers were mostly men, male jesters, singers, and musicians, called take omaki or hoken, were the original party starters. The very first geisha to emerge in the mid-18th century were, in fact, also men, but female performers, originally called a nageisha female artist, quickly grew in popularity. They were skilled, they were beautiful, and they offered a new kind of sophisticated entertainment. Here's a curious detail that highlights the distinction. Geisha were legally forbidden from competing with the licensed courtesans. There were strict regulations about their dress, their behavior, and even where they could sit in a room, all designed to maintain a clear boundary between the two professions. For example, a geisha's kimono, while beautiful, was supposed to be more subdued than a no-Iran-esque flamboyant costume. Her hairstyle was simpler. These rules were meant to ensure that the client's romantic and sexual attention remained focused on the courtesan, who was the main attraction. The geisha was the opening act, not the headliner. The relationship between the geisha and the oiran could be complex. On one level, they were partners in the business of entertainment. A successful party often required both. The oiran provided the glamour and the romantic fantasy, while the geisha provided the artistic energy and social grace. But there was also an underlying professional rivalry. As the Edo period wore on, the popularity of the geisha began to soar. Clients were drawn to their wit, their artistry, and their more approachable, less ritualized form of companionship. The elaborate and announcedly expensive rituals required to meet an oiran began to seem old-fashioned and stuffy to some. The chic, sophisticated, and comparatively affordable company of a geisha became increasingly fashionable. Historians are still debating the precise moment when the geisha's star began to eclipse the oiran. Some pinpoint the late 18th century as the turning point. As the merchant class grew more influential, their preference for the more subtle and modern charm of the geisha helped to shift the cultural tide. The oiran came to be seen as a relic of a more formal, aristocratic age, while the geisha represented the fresh, new spirit of the floating world. Eventually, the profession of the oiran would fade away almost completely, while the geisha tradition would survive, adapting and evolving into the modern era. Back in the room, the geisha finishes her song to appreciative applause from the samurai. She pours him more sake, engages him in somewhat witty banter, and then perhaps performs a slow, graceful dance. She is the perfect hostess. Her job is to make him feel clever, sophisticated, and at ease. She is warming up the room, preparing the stage for the main event that will follow later in the night. Understanding the difference between the geisha and the oiran is crucial to understanding the social landscape of Yoshiwara. One was an artist, the other a courtesan. One sold her talent. The other sold an elaborate fantasy that culminated in intimacy. Both were women of the floating world, but they walked very different, though parallel paths, and confusing the two would be like mistaking the concert pianist for the movie star she was hired to entertain. The night deepens. The geisha has departed, leaving behind a lingering melody and an air of relaxed pleasantry. The main courses of the meal have been cleared away, leaving only seiken small delicacies. The formal audition phase of the evening is drawing to a close. Now, the complex logistics of the actual rendezvous must be handled. And this is where another key player in the Yoshiwara ecosystem comes in to focus: the tea house. You've been in this tea house, or ochaya, for hours, but you may not have grasped its true function. You might think of it as just a restaurant or a waiting room, but the tea house was the central nervous system of Yoshiwara. It was the discreet, indispensable intermediary that made the entire, elaborate system work. Without the tea house, the worlds of the high-end clients and the high-ranking courtesans could never meet. The establishment our samurai is in is not a brothel. The Edo-era does not live here. She lives and works in a separate house, the maze or okiya. The client, especially a respectable one, would never approach a brothel directly. That would be crude and undignified. Instead, he would go to a trusted tea house, one where he had a relationship with the proprietor. The tea house acted as a combination of a private club, a booking agent, and a concierge service. The proprietor of the tea house, often a formidable woman known as the Occasion Mother, was a master of diplomacy and discretion. She knew all her clients, their tastes, their spending habits, and their social standing. She also had deep connections with all the major brothels. Her job was to orchestrate the entire evening. When the samurai decided he wanted to spend time with a particular Oiran, he told the occasion. She then sent a messenger to the Oiran's house to formally request her presence. She arranged for the geisha, the food, the drinks, every single detail. Essentially, the tea house provided a neutral, elegant space for the initial stages of the encounter. It was on this respectable ground that the introductions were made and the entertainment was provided. The tea house was a stage set for the performance of courtship. The most explicit parts of the transaction, the discussion of prices, the payment were all handled discreetly by the tea house staff. The client would likely never exchange money directly with the brothel. He would simply settle his bill with the tea house at a later date. This separation of the social ritual from the crass reality of payment was essential for maintaining the fantasy. Here's a peculiar and little-known aspect of the tea house's role: they were masters of information. The proprietors and staff were the keepers of all the secrets of the floating world. They knew which patrons were solvent and which were deep in debt. They knew about the rivalries between clients and the private preferences of the courtesans. They were the gatekeepers of reputation. A tea house could make or break a client. If you offended the occasion or failed to pay your bill, you could find yourself blacklisted, unable to get service at any respectable establishment in the district. Their power, though subtle, was immense. The tea house also served as a safe house for the samurai's reputation. By meeting in a tea house, he could maintain a degree of plausible deniability. He was simply attending a banquet, being entertained by artists. What happened later was a private matter. This discretion was what clients paid for. The paper-thin walls of Edo meant that secrets were hard to keep, but the tea houses of Yoshiwara were sanctuaries of silence. So, what happens now? The time for the actual assignation has arrived. The Oiran rises, and a complex transfer takes place. The samurai will not go to her brothel. That is where she lives with her sisters and attendants, a semi-private space. Instead, they will proceed to yet another type of establishment. Often, the tea house itself had private, secluded rooms upstairs for this purpose. Or, they might be guided to a nearby makiai, which literally means waiting for each other house. These were essentially high-end love hotels, establishments that provided elegant, private rooms for rent by the hour, or the night. The journey from the main party room to the private chamber is a quiet one. The boisterous entertainment is over. The attendants fade into the background. It is a moment of transition from the public performance to the private encounter. The tea house has fulfilled its primary function. It has taken a raw commercial transaction and draped it in layers of ritual, art, and elegance, transforming it into something that feels like a romantic conquest. Historians often struggle to fully document the inner workings of the tea houses, as so much of their business was based on unwritten rules and personal relationships. The line between a tea house or chaya, a house of ancient Asia, and a waiting house smakia could be blurry, and the functions often overlapped. What is clear is that this network of intermediary establishments was the essential lubricant for the entire machine. They created a buffer of respectability, managed the complex logistics, and allowed the fantasy of Yoshiwara to flourish. The samurai and the Edo-era disappear behind a final sliding screen. The tea house has done its job. It has built the bridge between the world of duty and the world of desire. And now, it leaves its clients to cross it. Let's now retreat from the lantern-lit world of Yoshiwara and journey back to the stark, masculine domain of the samurai. We need to explore a different, yet equally complex and ritualized, form of relationship that was prevalent within the warrior class. This was a bond that had nothing to do with women, pleasure quarters, or political marriage. It was a relationship between an older warrior and a young apprentice, a practice known as Shudo, the way of the youth. To understand Shudo, you have to erase your modern conceptions of love and sexuality. In the rigid, hyper-masculine world of the samurai, where emotional expression was suppressed and camaraderie was essential for survival, at least in the warring periods that preceded the Edo peace, a unique form of institutionalized pederasty took hold. This was not seen as a simple matter of sexual preference. Instead, it was idealized and elevated into a complex ethical and educational framework. You find yourself in a martial arts dojo. The air smells of sweat, wood, and discipline. An older, veteran samurai, perhaps in his late 20s or 30s, is sparring with a youth. The boy is in his early teens, his hair still in the boyish wakashu style, with long forelocks that have not yet been shaved off in the adult fashion. He is a page or an apprentice, learning the ways of the sword and the warrior code from his master. The older man is the enenja, the lover or mentor, and the boy is his kai or wakashu. Their relationship is the core of Shudo. On the surface, it was a mentorship. The enenja was responsible for the boy's education, not just in fighting techniques, but in literature, calligraphy, and proper conduct. He was to guide the youth into becoming an ideal samurai. The boy, in return, was expected to offer absolute loyalty, devotion, and, yes, physical intimacy to his mentor. This bond was considered the purest form of love in some samurai circles, far purer than the distracting and weakening love for a woman. The man's love for a woman was for procreation, a messy, domestic affair. The love between an enja and a wakashu, however, was seen as noble and elevating. It was a love between warriors, based on shared ideals of loyalty, duty, and the pursuit of excellence. It was supposed to make both partners better samurai. One of the most famous texts on this subject is the Hagakure, a collection of samurai wisdom compiled in the early 18th century. While it has become famous as a definitive text on Bushido, it also contains passages that praise Shudo in glowing terms. It speaks of the importance of a beautiful and loyal youth in inspiring a warrior to great deeds and upholding his honor. The ideal was that the older man's love would temper his ferocity with gentleness, while the boy's devotion would inspire him to be a worthy role model. A strange and specific aesthetic was associated with the wakashu. The ideal age for the youth in a Shudo relationship was during his adolescence, roughly from age 12 to 19 or 20. His beauty was celebrated in art and literature. This beauty was seen as androgynous and delicate, youthful femininity that had not yet hardened into adult masculinity. The sign of his transition out of this role was the Genpuku ceremony, a coming-of-age ritual where his charming boyish forelocks would be shaved off, and he would take on the adult top-knot hairstyle. Once his forelocks were gone, he was considered a man, and the romantic phase of the shudo relationship was expected to end. The practice of shudo was not hidden or stigmatized. It was openly acknowledged and, in many samurai domains, actively encouraged. It was seen as a way to foster loyalty and cohesion within the warrior ranks. A lord might encourage his retainers to form such bonds to ensure the stability and loyalty of his followers. The relationships were often formalized with written vows of fidelity, much like a marriage. However, historians have a much more complicated and critical view of shudo today. The idealized vision presented in samurai texts is one thing, the reality was likely much messier. The power imbalance is the most glaring issue. This was a relationship between a man in a position of authority and a boy who was his subordinate. The question of consent, as we understand it today, is deeply problematic. How much choice did a young page really have if his master, a powerful samurai, desired him? This is a point of significant academic debate. Some scholars argue that we must understand shudo within its own historical context, as a structured social institution that served a specific purpose in samurai society, and that applying modern moral judgments is anachronistic. They point to the emphasis on mutual consent and fidelity within the shudo ode itself. Other historians, however, argue that no amount of cultural context can erase the inherent coerciveness of the relationship. They see it as a system of institutionalized abuse, cloaked in the noble language of honor and mentorship. As you watch the sparring session end, the older samurai places a hand on the boy's shoulder. It's a gesture that is both proprietary and, perhaps, genuinely affectionate. The boy looks up at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated admiration. In this single moment, you can see the ideal of shudo, the mentor and the devoted pupil, but you can't shake the unsettling feeling of the power dynamic that underpins it all. Was this a noble bond of warriors, a beautiful and tragic form of ephemeral love, or was it simply the exploitation of the young and vulnerable by the powerful? Dressed up in the elegant language of the way of the warrior, the truth is likely buried somewhere in the unwritten, unspoken space between the two. You are now inside the private quarters of the veteran samurai, the enenja. The room is sparse and functional, dominated by a sword rack holding his precious day's hoe. The young wakashu is there, no longer a sparring partner, but an attendant. He moves with a quiet grace, pouring tea for his master, his movements deferential and precise. It is in this intimate space that you can observe the subtle, complex dynamics of their shudo relationship up close. The ideal of shudo was not just about mentorship, it was a school for samurai emotions. The enenja was supposed to teach the youth how to love, how to be loyal, and how to eventually become a responsible adult who would one day take a wife and have a family. The relationship was seen as a crucial developmental stage. The love between them was meant to be fiercely passionate but also educational. It was a love with a purpose. The code of conduct was surprisingly detailed. Fidelity was paramount. The enenja was expected to be a faithful mentor and protector, and the wakashu was expected to be utterly devoted to him alone. A youth who was promiscuous would bring shame upon himself and his mentor. The relationship was supposed to be exclusive. If another man showed interest in his wakashu, the enenja might be expected to defend his honor, sometimes even in a duel. The passion, in this sense, was tied directly to the samurai concepts of honor and possession. You watch them interact. The samurai speaks to the boy in a tone that is a strange mixture of command and tenderness. He might be correcting the boy's posture or quizzing him on a classic text. The boy, in turn, hangs on his every word. His devotion is palpable. For the wakashu, this relationship is his entire world. The enenja is his teacher, his protector, his role model, and his lover. He learns what it means to be a samurai by watching, serving, and loving this man. A fascinating and somewhat counterintuitive aspect of Shudo was its relationship with mainstream society. This was not a hidden, closeted practice. The Shudo relationship was public knowledge. After the Wakashu came of age, had his Genpuku ceremony, and took a wife, the bond with his former Enenja was expected to transform into a lifelong, platonic friendship. The older man would often help arrange the younger man's marriage. The ideal was a smooth transition from passionate love to loyal, brotherly camaraderie. The two men and their families would then be allied for life. But what did this all feel like? One of the few windows we have into the emotional texture of these relationships comes from popular literature and theater of the time. Kabuki plays and novels were filled with dramatic stories of Shudo love. These stories were often tragic, involving jealousy, betrayal, and honor-bound suicide. They were the romantic melodramas of their day, and their popularity suggests that the ideals of Shudo passionate loyalty, ephemeral beauty, and tragic love resonated deeply with the public. A strange but telling detail is the emphasis on the Wakashu's potential for violence. He was not just a pretty, passive object, he was a young samurai in training. The Hagakure tells stories of Wak, a shu who would ferociously avenge insults to their Enenja. The boy's delicate beauty was supposed to hide a core of steel. Part of the thrill and the perceived nobility of the relationship was this combination of aesthetics, softness, and warrior spirit. However, the reality of the power imbalance is impossible to ignore. The Enenja held all the cards. He was older, stronger, and held a higher social position. He controlled the boy's present and had enormous influence over his future. The idealized narratives of mutual devotion often paper over this fundamental inequality. While some relationships were undoubtedly based on genuine, reciprocal affection, the potential for coercion and exploitation was ever present. This is where historical interpretation becomes a minefield. The term pederasty itself is loaded with modern condemnation. Some historians argue for using more neutral, historically specific terms like age-structured homosexuality to avoid anachronistic judgments. They stress the institutional nature of Shudo and its acceptance within its own cultural framework. Other scholars push back, arguing that glossing over the exploitative aspects is a disservice to the historical reality. They contend that while we must understand the context, we must also be clear-eyed about the power dynamics at play. The debate over how to frame and understand Shudo as a cultural institution, a form of love, or a system of abuse is one of the most sensitive and ongoing discussions in the study of samurai society. As the evening draws on, the samurai dismisses the boy to his sleeping quarters, which may or may not be separate from his own. You are left with a powerful sense of ambiguity. You have seen the tenderness, the teaching, the shared code of honor. You have also felt the immense, unspoken weight of the power difference between them. The relationship between the warrior and the youth was a cornerstone of samurai masculinity, a bond forged in a world that had little room for other kinds of emotional expression, but it was a bond built on a foundation that, to modern eyes, looks deeply, troublingly unequal. The dojo and the private quarters gave you a glimpse of the Shudo ideal. Now, let's pull back the camera and look at the broader social landscape. Was this way of the youth truly about noble mentorship and loyal love? Or was it, at its core, an expression of power? This is the question that lurks beneath the surface of every beautifully penned poem and every dramatic kabuki play about the subject. The entire structure of samurai society was a pyramid of power. The shogun was at the top, followed by the daimyo, and then down through the ranks of retainers. Loyalty flowed upwards, and authority flowed downwards. Shudo relationships fit perfectly into this model. The Enenja, the older man, was in a position of authority. The Wakashu, the youth, was his subordinate. The relationship, therefore, was a microcosm of the feudal power structure itself. The loyalty the Wakashu offered his Enja was seen as a training ground for the ultimate loyalty he would owe his lord. The love and devotion he learned to show his mentor were the same emotions, refined and amplified, that he would be expected to demonstrate towards his daimyo. In this sense, Shudyu wasn't a subversion of the social order, it was a powerful reinforcement of it. It taught young men their place in the hierarchy and conditioned them to accept relationships based on a clear power differential. Consider the economic reality. High Wakashu was often from a lower ranking or less wealthy samurai family. By entering into a relationship with a higher ranking or more influential Enjo, the boy could gain a powerful patron. This patron could provide him with opportunities, introduce him to important people, and help secure his future career. The relationship was not just emotional and physical, it was a strategic career move. The boy offered his beauty, loyalty, and companionship, and in return, he received mentorship and, crucially, social advancement. It was a transaction, even if it was wrapped in the language of pure love. This transactional nature introduces a layer of complexity. If the Wakashu was a willing participant, using his own assets, his youth and beauty to secure a better future, does that make the relationship less exploitative? It's a difficult question. It suggests a degree of agency on the part of the youth, but it's an agency born of a system where his options were already limited by his social standing. There's a peculiar and telling detail that reveals the intersection of power and intimacy, the practice of testing a youth's fidelity. Samurai literature is full of stories where an ninja might deliberately spread a false rumor or create a misunderstanding to see how his Wakashu would react. Would the boy remain loyal in the face of adversity? Would he be willing to die to prove his devotion? These tests were framed as trials of love, but they were also raw assertions of power, forcing the subordinate partner to prove his worthiness over and over again. Furthermore, the idealized exclusivity of the relationship often broke down in reality. A powerful lord or a high-ranking samurai might have several favored youths, and in some contexts, particularly in the theatrical world of kabuki, where young male actors playing female roles were also objects of desire, the lines between patron, mentor, and consumer became incredibly blurred. Some Wakashu attached to powerful men were essentially kept boys, their status entirely dependent on maintaining the affection of their patron. This leads us to the core of the academic debate: was Shudu primarily about love, or primarily about power? The traditionalist interpretation, based on samurai texts like the Hagikure, emphasizes the former. It presents Shudu as a genuine, if culturally specific, expression of love and ethical mentorship. The more critical, modern interpretation, however, argues that you cannot separate the romance from the power structure it existed within. This school of thought posits that the language of leavened loyalty was a sophisticated ideological mask for what was, in essence, a system for socializing young men into a rigid hierarchy and a way for powerful men to exercise their dominance in a highly personal and intimate way. The historical consensus on this is still evolving, is a phrase you'll hear a lot in academic circles discussing Shudu, as scholars try to balance cultural context with critical analysis. The end of a Shudu relationship, the Genpoku ceremony, is also revealing. The shaving of the forelocks was a public act that signified the boy had become a man. He was now ready to take his place as an adult in the samurai hierarchy, to marry, and potentially to become an Enju himself. The system was designed to be self-perpetuating. The boy who was once the object of desire and the subordinate partner would eventually become the dominant partner in a new relationship. The cycle of power would continue. So as you reflect on the warrior and his young apprentice, you see that their bond cannot be reduced to a simple explanation. It was not just love, and it was not just power. It was a complex, tangled knot of both. It was a system where genuine affection could coexist with stark inequality, where mentorship was intertwined with exploitation, and where the most personal of relationships was also a powerful tool for maintaining the social and political order. The ideal was loyalty, but the reality was that this loyalty was always inextricably linked to power. Let's imagine you're taking a stroll through a bustling market street, not in the glamorous Yoshiwara, but in a more common part of Edo. You duck into a small, unassuming bookshop to escape the midday sun. The shop is cramped, smelling of old paper and ink. As the proprietor is distracted, you notice a stack of slim, paper-bound books tucked away in a corner, wrapped in a plain cover. Your curiosity gets the better of you. You slide one out and open it, and your eyes widen. You have just discovered shunga. The word literally translates to spring pictures, a delicate, poetic euphemism for what is, to put it plainly, explicit erotic art. The book in your hands is filled with woodblock prints depicting men and women, and sometimes individuals of the same sex, engaged in a wide variety of intimate acts. The images are graphic, anatomically detailed if fantastically exaggerated, and utterly devoid of shame. This is one of the most striking paradoxes of Edo Japan. You've just come from a world governed by the stoic, repressive code of the samurai and the rigid formality of their marriages. Yet, at the same time, this society produced and consumed a vast quantity of incredibly frank and joyful erotic art. Shunga was not a hidden, deviant subculture. It was a mainstream, popular art form, enjoyed by men and women from nearly all social classes, from samurai to merchants to housewives. As you flip through the pages, the first thing you notice is the artistry. These are not crude, cheap drawings. Many shunga prints were designed by the greatest ukiyo-e masters of the day, artists like Hokwasi, Utamaro, and Harunobu, the very same artists who were famous for their landscapes and portraits of beautiful women. They poured the same level of skill and creativity into their erotic works as they did into their more respectable art. The lines are elegant, the colors are vibrant, and the compositions are dynamic and sophisticated. The content itself is startlingly diverse. You see scenes of tender romance, passionate encounters, and humorous, almost slapstick situations. The lovers are often depicted in beautiful, richly patterned kimonos, their clothes in disarray, adding to the visual richness of the scene. The settings are equally varied: a private room in the tea house, a secluded spot on a riverbank, even a busy kitchen, with the lovers trying to steal a moment of privacy. It's a window into a world where sexuality was not necessarily hidden away in the bedroom, but was an integral part of everyday life. A particularly weird and wonderful aspect of shunga is the frequent presence of text. The characters in the prints are oft unspeaking, their dialogue written in elegant calligraphy beside them. These conversations could be romantic, tender, or, surprisingly often, very funny. The lovers might be cracking jokes, teasing each other, or commenting on the pleasure they are experiencing. This gives the prints a narrative quality, transforming them from static images into lively, theatrical scenes. It suggests that sex was not just a silent, serious act, but something that could be accompanied by laughter and lightheartedness. Why was shunga so popular and so openly accepted? The reasons are complex. Part of it stems from the Shinto tradition, which has a more naturalistic, world-affirming view of life and fertility compared to the more ascetic aspects of Buddhism or Confucianism. There was the same deep-seated cultural concept of original sin that shaped Western attitudes towards sexuality. Sex was seen as a natural, healthy part of human existence. Shunga albums were also considered to be good luck charms. Samurai would sometimes carry them into battle as a talisman against death. They were also thought to protect a home from fire, which, in a city like Edo, was no small concern. This belief might seem bizarre, but it speaks to the idea that these images, bursting with life and vitality, were seen as a powerful force against destruction and decay. They were affirmations of life in its most potent form. Of course, the official government position was a bit more complicated. The Takigoji shogunate, with its emphasis on public morality, did occasional issue edicts banning the production and sale of indecent materials, including shunga. However, these bans were enforced sporadically and were largely ineffective. The demand was simply too high, and the publishers were too clever. They would often release shunga without the artist's or publisher's seal, making it difficult to trace the source. The existence of these official bans is a point of debate for historians. Does it prove that shunga was a forbidden fruit, or were the bans more of a token gesture, a way for the government to appear virtuous while turning a blind eye to a massively popular and lucrative industry? You carefully slide the book back into its wrapper. Your brief encounter with shunga has completely upended your understanding of this society. You've seen the public face of Edo Japan and the stoic samurai, the demure wife, the formal rituals. But shunga reveals a completely different side of the world that was earthy, humorous, and surprisingly comfortable with the messiness and joy of human desire. It suggests that behind the paper screens and the strict social codes, there was a rich, private world of sensuality that was not a source of shame, but of art, humor, and even good luck. The spring pictures were the secret, smiling soul of a society that was far more complex than its official rules would have you believe. You take another, closer look at the shunga print. You're no longer just struck by its explicitance. You're starting to notice the details. You're moving past the initial shock and trying to read the image like a historical document. This is what art historians and cultural scholars do when they study shunga. They decode these pillow pictures, imakurai, another euphemism to understand the attitudes, fantasies, and anxieties of Edo Japan. The most immediately obvious feature in many shunga prints is the dramatic exaggeration of the genitalia. They are depicted as impossibly large, often taking up a significant portion of the composition. A modern viewer might see this as purely pornographic or even comical. But the reason for this exaggeration is a subject of much scholarly discussion. It wasn't about anatomical accuracy, it was about symbolic emphasis. In a woodblock print, the most important elements are often rendered largest to draw the viewers. Ions signify their importance. By making the sexual organs the focal point, the artist is stating, in no uncertain terms, that this is the heart of the action, the source of the energy in the scene. Furthermore, this exaggeration was a kind of artistic challenge. The bodies of the lovers are almost always fully or partially clothed in exquisite, patterned kimonos. The artists took great delight in the contrast between the beautiful, concealing fabric and the revealed, exaggerated anatomy. The challenge was to create a scene that was both elegant and explicit, to integrate the raw energy of sex with the high aesthetics of textile design and refined living. The clothing isn't just incidental, it's a key part of the visual and narrative experience, reminding the viewer that these are civilized, cultured people engaged in a very natural act. You also notice the faces of the lovers. They are often serene, blissful, or lost in a kind of transcendent pleasure. There is rarely any sense of shame, guilt, or conflict. This reflects the prevailing attitude that sex, when consensual, was a positive and life-affirming experience. The art celebrates the pleasure of the act, not just its procreative function. The peculiar and recurring motif in shunga is the presence of voyeurs. Sometimes, you can spot a small figure peeking through a hole in a paper screen, or a servant accidentally stumbling upon a scene. These figures often have comical expressions of shock or fascination. This might seem strange, but it served a clever purpose. The voyeur acts as a stand-in for the viewer of the print, acknowledging the act of looking and, through humor, diffusing any potential awkwardness. It creates a shared, communal experience of viewing, as if the artist is winking at you, saying, "Yes, we're all looking at this together." The debate among historians about shunga as purpose is fascinating. Was it primarily for male pleasure, a form of pornography for a male-dominated society? This was the long-held assumption. However, more recent scholarship has challenged this view. Many scholars now argue that women were a significant audience for shunga. The prints were often part of a bride's trousseau, intended as a form of sex education, a guide to the physical aspects of marriage. The frequent depiction of mutual pleasure and the active, engaged role of the female figures in the prints support this idea. The woman is rarely a passive object. She is an equal participant in the act, her pleasure given as much importance as the man's. This leads to another debated question. How realistic are these depictions? Are we seeing a true reflection of sexual life in Edo Japan? Or are we seeing a male-authored fantasy of what it should be? The truth is probably a mixture. The exaggerated anatomy is clearly fantasy. The constant depiction of mutual, ecstatic pleasure might be more of an ideal than a daily reality. However, the settings, the clothing, the everyday objects scattered around the rooms of fan, or tea set, S3X ground these scenes in a tangible reality. They suggest that these idealized encounters are happening within the context of real, everyday life. Shunga, then, is perhaps best understood not as a documentary, but as a form of magical realism, a fantasy of perfect pleasure rooted in the familiar details of the real world. As you study the print, you see a poem inscribed in the corner. It might be a classic verse about love, or a witty, suggestive haiku. The integration of high literature with explicit imagery is key. It elevated the prints from mere pornography to a sophisticated art form. It suggested that carnal love and refined artistic sensibility were not opposites, but two sides of the same coin. An educated person could appreciate both the elegant calligraphy of the poem and the raw energy of the image. Decoding shunga means looking past the surface. It means seeing the prints not just as images of sex, but as complex cultural artifacts that reveal a society's comfort with sensuality, its sense of humor, its aesthetic values, and its idealized vision of human connection. The pillow pictures were not just meant to arouse, they were meant to be read, admired, and discussed, offering a rich and surprisingly nuanced conversation about the role of desire in human life. As you continue to explore the hidden stack of shunga in the bookshelf, you come across a print that makes you chuckle. In the midst of a passionate embrace, one of the lovers' hairpins has come loose and is poking the other in the cheek. In another, a small dog is playfully tugging at the hem of a discarded kimono, oblivious to the human drama unfolding above it. These small, humorous details reveal an often overlooked aspect of shunga, its sense of humor. While many prints focus on idealized passion, a significant number are filled with a kind of gentle, earthy comedy. The artists and their audience clearly understood that sex wasn't always a transcendent, poetic experience. It could also be awkward, messy, and funny. This willingness to laugh at sex, to treat it with a sense of levity and playfulness, stands in stark contrast to the solemnity you've seen in the samurai's world. The humor in shunga operates on several levels. There's the situational comedy, like the lovers being interrupted by a clumsy servant or a curious child. There's a slapstick quality to some images, where the exaggerated anatomy leads to comical predicaments. Then there's the witty dialogue inscribed on the prints, with lovers teasing each other with clever puns and double entendres. The Japanese language, with its abundance of homophones, is perfectly suited for this kind of wordplay. A seemingly innocent comment about a flower or a type of food could carry a saucy second meaning that the Edo audience would have instantly understood. This humor served an important social function. It made the explicit content more accessible and less intimidating. By framing sex within a context of laughter and lightheartedness, shunga helped to normalize it, stripping away the layers of taboo and treating it as just another part of the rich tapestry of human experience, like eating, drinking, or enjoying a festival. It's an approach that feels surprisingly modern. One particularly quirky subgenre of humorous shunga involves mythological or folkloric creatures. You might find a print depicting Tengu long-nosed goblins or Kappa river imps in amorous situations. These prints were often satirical, using the non-human characters to poke fun at human follies and desires. They were a way to explore more outlandish or taboo themes at a safe, comical distance. For instance, a print of a tengu with its comically long nose being used in an erotic way was a visual pun that the audience would have found hilarious. This embrace of humor in the bedroom speaks volumes about the culture's underlying attitudes. It suggests a comfort with the human body and its functions that is profoundly different from a more puritanical worldview. If you can laugh about sex, you are less likely to be ashamed of it. This is a point that historians who study the emotional landscape of the past, a field sometimes called the history of emotions, often emphasize. The presence of humor in such an intimate context is a powerful clue to a society's emotional vocabulary. Edo Japan, it seems, had a rich vocabulary for sexual joy and absurdity. The debate among scholars has risen about whether the humor exists, it's undeniable, but about what its primary purpose was. Was the humor a way to sugarcoat the titillation, making the pornography more palatable to a wider audience, including women, or was the humor the main point? With the sex being the vehicle for the joke, some scholars argue that many shunga prints are better understood as a form of social satire. They use the intimate setting of the bedroom to comment on social types: the pompous samurai, the greedy merchant, the vain courtesan. By showing these figures in a moment of physical vulnerability, the artist could subtly undercut their public personas and expose their all-too-human desires. This use of humor as satire is especially evident in a type of book called keibiyoshi. These were cheap, mass-produced illustrated novellas, the comic books of their day. They were filled with witty, satirical stories about life in Edo, and they often contained shunga-esque scenes that were played for laughs. It was all part of the same vibrant, irreverent urban culture that gave birth to kabuki and the floating world. So, as you place the humorous print back on the pile, you have a more complete picture. The world of Edo sexuality was not a monolith. It wasn't just the cold duty of the samurai marriage, the tragic glamour of the Oiran, or the noble tragedy of Shudo. It also had this other dimension, one filled with laughter, wit, and a healthy dose of silliness. The ability to find humor in the bedroom reveals a culture that was, in many ways, far more relaxed and sophisticated in its understanding of human nature than its rigid social structure might suggest. It's a reminder that even in the most formal societies, people have always found a way to laugh, to play, and to connect with each other, even in the most intimate of moments. Your exploration of Edo's private life has uncovered a world of surprising openness and artistic expression. But this raises a very practical and pressing question. In a society where sexuality was openly depicted and commercialized sex was readily available, how did people deal with the consequences specifically? How did they handle contraception and family planning? You leave the bookshop and find yourself wandering near a pharmacy. The shop is a treasure trove of dried herbs, minerals, and mysterious powders stored in ceramic jars. This is where the practical, and often desperate, side of sexuality would have been addressed. The methods of contraception available in Edo, Japan were strange and often ineffective mix of folk wisdom, rudimentary science, and outright magical thinking. The primary goal for many, especially those outside the samurai class who weren't obsessed with producing a single male heir, was to limit family size. For merchants and artisans living in cramped urban quarters, too many children could mean financial ruin. And for the women working in Yoshiwara, pregnancy was a professional disaster. So, the demand for reliable contraception was high. The supply, however, was another matter. One of the most common methods was a form of physical barrier, a kind of primitive condom. These were not made of latex. Of course, they were typically crafted from thin, soft leather kyotai or capital city sack, or, in some cases, from the cleaned cecum of an animal's intestine. As you can imagine, they were expensive, reusable, and probably not very comfortable or effective. Their use was likely limited to the wealthiest clients of the pleasure quarters. More common were various methods that women themselves would use. These ranged from the somewhat plausible to the truly bizarre. Women might use pessaries, or suppositories made of various substances believed to have contraceptive properties. A common ingredient was rock salt, which might have had some spermicide effect but would also have been incredibly irritating. Here's a particularly strange and revealing example of a folk method. Some texts advised a woman to insert a ball of soft, pliable paper or even a piece of seaweed into her vagina before intercourse to block the semen. One popular material was the tough, fibrous tissue of a certain type of bamboo sheath. These methods were, at best, unreliable. Their widespread use points to a sense of desperation and a willingness to try anything. Another common practice was douching immediately after intercourse. Women would use solutions of salt water, tea, or even vinegar, hoping to wash out the semen before it could cause a pregnancy. While the acidity of vinegar might have some effect, the overall efficacy of this method was extremely low. Beyond these physical methods, there was a whole world of orally consumed potions and magical charms. Herbalists would sell concoctions of plants and minerals that were believed to prevent conception. The ingredients could be anything from dried herbs to powdered insects. The effectiveness of these is highly doubtful, and some may have been genuinely harmful. The line between medicine and magic was incredibly thin. A woman might be advised to perform a certain ritual or carry a specific amulet to ward off pregnancy. For example, some believed that if a woman stepped over a musket or an axe immediately after intercourse, she would not conceive. These beliefs highlight the immense anxiety surrounding unwanted pregnancy and the lack of reliable scientific knowledge. When contraception failed, which it often did, people resorted to more drastic measures. Infanticide, known as mabiki, a term borrowed from agriculture, meaning to thin out seedlings, was a grim and tragic reality, particularly in rural areas facing famine. While officially illegal and condemned by both the government and Buddhist teachings, it was a desperate measure taken by families who simply could not afford to feed another mouth. Abortion was also practiced, though it was a dangerous and clandestine affair. It was performed by back alley practitioners, often using crude surgical methods or highly toxic herbal potions. The risks to the woman's life were enormous. The academic world continues to piece together the history of contraception and family planning in Japan, drawing on medical texts, folk literature, legal documents, and even archaeological evidence. Historians debate the true prevalence of practices like mabiki. Some argue that historical accounts were exaggerated by officials to paint a picture of rural immorality, while others maintain that it was a tragically common, if hidden, practice. The demographics of despair is a term some scholars use to describe the stark choices faced by the poor. As you stand outside the pharmacy, you realize that for all the beauty of the Shanga prince and the glamour of the floating world, the biological reality of sex was a source of constant worry. The lack of reliable contraception cast a long, dark shadow over the intimate lives of the people of Edo. The freedom and playfulness depicted in the art was always accompanied by a high-stakes gamble. For every scene of blissful pleasure in a Shanga print, there was an undrawn scene of a woman anxiously brewing a bitter herbal tea, or a family making an impossible choice. The story of sex in any era is incomplete without understanding the very real fear of its consequences. You spent a lot of time in the rarefied air of the samurai estates and the intoxicating but tragic world of Yoshiwara. But these were the extremes of Edo society. What about everyone else? What was love, marriage, and sex like for the vast majority of the city's population? The chonin, the townspeople, the merchants, artisans, and laborers who made up the vibrant heart of the city. To find out, you wander away from the grand avenues and into the narrow, crowded back streets where the commoners lived and worked. The buildings are smaller here, more jumbled together. The ground floor of almost every building is a workshop or a shop front a noodle cellar, a barrel maker, a fabric dyer. The upper floor is the family's living quarters. Life is lived publicly, noisily, and on top of one another. For the Chonin, marriage was also a practical affair, but the considerations were different from those of the samurai. It wasn't about political alliances, it was about business and family continuity. A merchant would want his son to marry the daughter of another merchant, creating a sound business partnership. An artisan would look for a diligent, hard-working wife who could help run the family shop. A dowry was important, but so was a bride's reputation for being thrifty and industrious. Love, however, played a much larger role here than it did among the samurai. While many marriages were arranged by parents or a go-between, the feelings of the young couple were often taken into consideration. The ideal was to find a match that was both practical and affectionate. The popular literature of the time, especially the works of writers like Ahara Saikaku, was filled with stories of passionate love affairs, elopementes, and romantic triangles among the townspeople. This suggests that the pursuit of love and romance was a central theme in their culture, not a forbidden concept. A fascinating difference was the concept of divorce for a samurai wife. As you saw, divorce was a unilateral, disgraceful dismissal. For the Chonin, it was a much more mutual and common affair. If a marriage wasn't working, for reasons ranging from infertility to simple incompatibility, a couple could agree to separate. The wife would return to her family, often taking her dowry with her. While it wasn't celebrated, it didn't carry the same deep stigma as it did in the samurai class. This gave Chonin women a degree of agency and independence that was unthinkable for their aristocratic counterparts. What about their sex slaves? The townspeople were the primary audience for shungan, the erotic novels. So we know that sex was a topic of open interest and humor. Their attitude seems to have been pragmatic and earthy. Sex was a natural pleasure, a part of a healthy marriage, and also a source of good jokes. The rigid separation between the pure wife and the sensual courtesan that defined the samurai world was much less distinct here. A man might visit the pleasure quarters if he had the money, but the ideal of a fulfilling, companion-ate marriage that included a healthy sex life was very much alive. A peculiar institution among the commoners was the yobiei, which literally means night crawling. In some rural communities, and even in the looser urban neighborhoods, it was a semi-accepted courtship ritual where a young, unmarried man would secretly visit his beloved at night. He would creep into her house with the tacit, blind-eye consent of her parents and spend the night with her. If the relationship became serious and the woman became pregnant, it would typically lead to marriage. It was a strange, informal system that allowed young people to exercise some choice in their partners before a formal arrangement was made. It's a practice that shocks modern sensibilities, but highlights a more fluid and pragmatic approach to premarital relationships in some communities. However, life for the Chonin was not a romantic comedy. Adultery was a serious offense, especially for the wife. The merchant's wife who was unfaithful brought shame and potential financial ruin upon the household. If caught, both she and her lover could face severe punishment, including, in some cases, public execution. The law, handed down by the samurai authorities, was harsh. The debate among historians here often revolves around the true extent of the Chonin as freedom. Looking at their vibrant popular culture, their seemingly more companion-ate marriages, and their pragmatic approach to life, it's easy to romanticize them as being more liberated than the stiffened formal samurai. However, they were still living under a rigid authoritarian regime. They were subject to the same harsh laws and the same patriarchal social structures. The freedom of the Chonin was a relative one. They may have had more emotional and social flexibility than the samurai, but their lives were still governed by a strict set of rules and economic necessities. As you watch a shopkeeper and his wife working side by side, laughing as they serve a customer, you see a partnership that feels familiar and real. Their relationship is not defined by grand political strategy or tragic glamour. It's built on shared work, shared struggles, and a shared life in the bustling, messy, vibrant heart of the city. Theirs is a world where love might not conquer all, but it was at least allowed to be part of the equation. It was in these crowded backstreets, far from the castles and the pleasure palaces, that something resembling a modern idea of companionate marriage was beginning to take shape. Let's return to the quiet, dignified samurai compound. You've seen the two separate worlds, that the samurai husband inhabits the world of duty with his wife, then the world of pleasure in Yoshiwara. But what happens if these two carefully separated worlds collide? What happens when the paper screens are not thick enough to keep the secrets out? Imagine the samurai wife. Her name is perhaps Kyo. Her life is a quiet tapestry of household management, artistic pursuits, and the endless, patient waiting for an heir. Her husband is a distant figure, a lord to be served. She knows he spends evenings out. It is his right. It is not her place to ask where he goes or what he does. To show jealousy is a failing, a breach of the highest decorum. She maintains her placid composure, the perfect mask of the samurai wife. But one day, the mask slips. Perhaps a gossiping servant lets a detail drop. Perhaps she finds a receipt from a tea house, a small, elegant trinket that is not for her, or the faint, sweet scent of a perfume on her husband's clothes that she does not recognize. Or maybe, in a moment of quiet desperation, she goes through his things and finds it, a beautifully printed Sugoroku board, a popular board game. But this is not a normal game. It's a Yoshiwara Sugoroku, a game where the squares represent the different stages of visiting the pleasure quarter, from entering the main gate to meeting a famous Ohiron. It's a playful, celebratory depiction of the world he visits. In that moment, the abstract knowledge of her husband's freedom becomes a concrete, painful reality. The carefully constructed piece of her world shatters. The serene garden outside her window suddenly seems like a prison. The beautiful calligraphy she practices feels like a meaningless distraction. The silence of the house is no longer peaceful, it is heavy with unspoken truths. What can she do? The code of her glass gives her no outlet for her feelings. To confront her husband would be an unthinkable act of defiance. It would shame him, and more importantly, it would shame her by revealing her unbecoming jealousy. To confide in her mother-in-law is impossible. The older woman would likely scold her for her weakness and remind her of her duty. She is utterly alone with this knowledge, trapped in a cage of silence and decorum. This internal conflict of the samurai wife is a theme that later Japanese novelists, long after the Edo period, would explore with great psychological depth. But during the period itself, her voice is almost entirely absent from the historical record. We can only speculate about her inner turmoil. We can imagine the quiet moments of despair, the silent tears shed behind a paper screen when no one is watching. Here's a small, poignant detail from the material culture of the time, the Tansuha. This was a chest of drawers, oft and beautifully crafted, where a woman kept her personal belongings, including her kimonos and her dowry items. For many samurai wives, this dancer was her only truly personal space, a small repository of her identity before she was married. One can imagine her, in a moment of sorrow, opening a drawer and touching a piece of fabric from her childhood, a tangible link to a life before she became a wife, a life where her own feelings might have mattered. This scenario raises a fascinating question for historians. How much did samurai wives really know? And how did they cope? The official ideology demanded blissful ignorance or, failing that, dignified acceptance. But it's hard to believe that these intelligent, observant women were entirely in the dark. The don't ask, don't tell policy was likely a fragile truce, a shared fiction that allowed the household to function. The wife pretended not to know, and the husband pretended she didn't know. The academic debate on this topic centers on the concept of female agency within extreme patriarchal constraints. Some scholars argue that by maintaining the peace of the household and managing the situation through strategic silence, These women were exercising a subtle form of power. They were not passive victims, but active participants in maintaining the social order, even at great personal cost. They were keepers of the peace. Other historians find this view to be an overly generous interpretation, arguing that this agency was so constrained as to be almost meaningless. They emphasize the profound psychological toll that this system of emotional repression must have taken. Did this stoicism lead to depression, anxiety, or other forms of quiet suffering? It's a question that history, with its focus on public records, can probably never fully answer. When the two worlds collide, even in this small, private way, it exposes the fundamental fragility of the entire system. The samurai's honor code was not a fortress. It was a carefully balanced house of cards, predicated on silence, separation, and the emotional labor of women. The discovery of that board game is not just a personal betrayal, it's a crack in the foundation of her world. It reveals that the values she has dedicated her life to upholding purity, fidelity, domestic harmony, are a one-sided sham. She puts the game away, her hands steady, her face once again a placid mask. Her husband will never know she found it. She will continue to perform her duties with impeccable grace, but something inside her has changed forever. The serene surface remains, but beneath it, the quiet, unseen rebellion of the heart has begun. The collision of worlds happens not with a bang, but with the silent closing of a drawer. Let's step back into the bustling world of the Chan and the townspeople. You've seen their popular art in the form of shunga, but their literary world was just as vibrant and, in many ways, even more revealing. You find yourself back in that little bookshop, but this time you're not looking for illicit prints. You're looking at the most popular books of the day, and you pick up a slim volume. The cover has a cartoonish, colorful illustration. This is a kashokubo-en, a libertine book, or, more simply, an erotic novel. These books were the best sellers of their time, consumed voraciously by the literate-urban population. They were the literary equivalent of the floating world, witty, stylish, and obsessed with the pursuit of love and pleasure. The pioneer and undisputed master of this genre was Ohara Saikaku, a former merchant who, in the late 17th century, revolutionized Japanese literature with his tales of amorous adventures. You open the book, a copy of Saikaku's most famous work, The Life of an Amorous Man Kas Hokuichi Diotoko. The novel tells the story of its hero, Yoan Osuke, from his first precocious romantic encounter at the age of 7 to his final journey at the age of 60, when he set sail for a mythical isle of women, still in search of new pleasures. Then Osuke's life is a grand tour of the entire landscape of Edo period sexuality. He has affairs with court ladies, courtesans of every rank, samurai wives, humble servants, and even boys. He is the ultimate connoisseur of love, a man who dedicates his entire life to the art of seduction. What's striking about these stories is their tone. They are not grim warnings about the dangers of lust. They are celebrations of it. Kaku writes with a worldly, humorous, and non-judgmental voice. In Osuke's relentless pursuit of pleasure is portrayed not as a moral failing, but as a kind of aesthetic quest. He is a hero of the floating world, a man who lives by the principles of Ikai and sophisticated hedonism. The books are a guide to this world, filled with details about the customs of the pleasure quarters, the latest fashions, and the clever strategies one needed to succeed in the game of love. These novels offer a stark contrast to the official samurai ideology. The samurai code prized duty over feeling, and self-denial over self-indulgence. Kaku's heroes turn this on its head. For them, desire is the central motivating force of life, and the pursuit of pleasure is a noble art form. This represents a revolutionary shift in values, a cultural rebellion led by the newly confident merchant class. They were creating their own heroes and their own moral universe, one that celebrated the very things the samurai professed to disdain: money, fashion, and sensual pleasure. A peculiar feature of these books is their almost encyclopedic quality. Kaku and his imitators love to create lists. The Life of an Amorous Man catalogs the 742 women and 725 men that Yo and Osuke has supposedly loved. The stories are less about deep psychological character development and more about variety and scope. They are a showcase of the myriad forms that love and desire can take. It's a very different way of telling a story, focused on breadth of experience rather than depth of emotion. Of course, there is a debate among literary scholars about how to interpret these works. Are they simply light-hearted entertainment, the popular fiction of their day, or do they contain a deeper social critique? Some scholars argue that Saikaku's work, for all its celebratory tone, also contains a subtle melancholy. His heroes are constantly moving, constantly seeking the next conquest, but they never seem to find lasting satisfaction. This endless quest for novelty, some argue, is a critique of the superficiality of the floating world, a hint that a life dedicated solely to fleeting pleasures is ultimately an empty one. Is Yo-Nos Yukei a hero to be emulated, or is he a tragic figure? A prisoner of his own desires. The ambiguity is part of what makes the work so enduring. Furthermore, the women in these novels are a fascinating subject of study. While the stories are told from a male point of view, the female characters are far from being passive victims. They are oft unclever, witty, and sexually assertive. Kaku also wrote a companion volume, The Life of an Amorous Woman, which tells the story of a woman's descent from a high-ranking court lady to a common streetwalker, all driven by her insatiable desire. While her story is more tragic than Yo-Nos, she is portrayed with a great deal of sympathy. She is a powerful, complex character, a victim of her desires, but also a defiant agent of them. This focus on female desire and agency is remarkable for its time. As you close the book, you have a new appreciation for the shonen world. They weren't just consumers of culture, they were creators of a sophisticated and subversive literary tradition. Through these libertine books, they explored the complexities of human desire with a frankness and humor that still feels fresh today. They created a world where the pursuit of love was not the distraction from life, but the very meaning of it. These novels were the manifesto of the floating world, a declaration that the passions of the human heart were the story worth telling. The sun is setting on your journey through Edo. The golden light catches the tiled roofs, and the shadows in the narrow alleys lengthen. And just as the sun sets on this day, you can feel the sun setting on the era you've been exploring. The floating world, with its glamorous courtesans and swaggering dandies, seems eternal and unchanging, but it was as transient as the cherry blossoms that lined its avenues. The twilight of the Yoshiwara was a long, slow process, driven by deep shifts in the economy, culture, and politics of Japan. You find yourself back at the great gate of Yoshiwara, but the atmosphere feels different now. The boisterous energy has faded, replaced by a sense of weariness. The paint on the tea houses is a little more chipped, the lanterns a little dimmer. The world inside, once the epicenter of fashion and culture, is starting to feel a bit old-fashioned, a bit stuck in the past. One of the main reasons for this decline was economic. The ruinously expensive rituals of the Edo-era were sustainable only as long as there were patrons with bottomless pockets and a taste for lavish, aristocratic display. As the Edo period wore on, the economic power of the samurai class waned. Many samurai were living on fixed stipends that didn't keep up with inflation, and they simply couldn't afford the spectacular expense of being a patron to a top courtesan. The wealthy merchants, who had the money, found that their tastes were changing. They began to prefer a more subtle, modern form of chic. This is where the rising star of a geisha comes back into the picture. As you saw, the geisha offered a different kind of companionship, witty, artistic, and sophisticated, but without the crippling lie expensive in time time-consuming rituals of the Edo-era. A man could enjoy an evening of clever conversation and beautiful music with a geisha for a fraction of the cost of a formal audience with an Edo-era. The geisha was the new, smarter choice for the discerning man of taste. The market was shifting. Then the Edo-era, with their elaborate processions and rigid protocols, were being priced out of their own game. The culture itself was changing. The early, explosive creativity of the floating world began to ossify. The kabuki plays became more formulaic. The ukiyo-e prints, while still beautiful, lost some of their raw, innovative energy. What was once rebellious and fresh became traditional and conservative. The floating world, which had defined itself by being on the cutting edge of fashion and style, was becoming a museum of its own past. A small but telling detail of this decline can be seen in the language. The term Edo-era, once a mark of the highest distinction, gradually fell out of use. The remaining high-ranking courtesans were still there, but the magic and cultural power associated with the title had faded. The very idea of the castle-toppling courtesan began to seem like a legend from a bygone era. Another factor was the changing legal and social landscape. The shogunate, in its later years, went through periods of moral and fiscal reform. These tentpole reforms in the 1840s, for example, cracked down hard on luxury and what was seen as decadent entertainment. While these crackdowns were often temporary, they disrupted the economy of the pleasure quarters and chipped away at the prestige of the floating world. The core of the issue, which historians often debate, is whether the floating world died a natural death from cultural exhaustion or if it was killed by external forces. The internal decay argument suggests that the culture simply ran out of steam. Its own excesses and rigidities made it unsustainable. The external forces argument points to the broader economic decline of the late Edo period and the increasing social and political instability. The truth, as usual, is likely a combination of both. The world outside Yoshiwara as well was changing, and the fantasy world within could not remain insulated forever. You watch as a client, a wealthy-looking merchant, leaves a tea house. He looks not triumphant, but tired. The fantasy seems to have worn thin. The illusion of romance and escape is harder to maintain when the world outside is full of uncertainty. The floating world was a product of a long, stable peace and a rising urban economy. As both of these things began to falter, the foundation of the Yokio started to crack. The nightless city was not immune to the dawn. The perpetual twilight of its lanterns could not hold back the morning of a new era. The world of the Edo-era, the Shunga Prince, and the amorous heroes of Saikaku's novels was a beautiful, complex, and contradictory dream. But like all dreams, it had to end. The walls around Yoshiwara were built to keep its women in, but they also served to keep the future out. And now, the future was knocking at the gate. The air in Edo is charged with a new kind of energy, a nervous excitement mixed with apprehension. It's the mid-19th century, and the insulated world of Takugoja, Japan is about to be shattered. The black ships of American Commodore at Uperi have arrived in Edo Bay, their steam engines puffing black smoke into the pristine sky. These ships are not just a military threat, they are a cultural tsunami, carrying with them a set of ideas and values that will challenge every aspect of the society you have been exploring. The Meiji Restoration is on the horizon. This moment of forced opening to the West triggered a profound identity crisis in Japan. The nation's leaders embarked on a frantic mission to modernize, to adopt Western technology, science, and political systems in order to avoid the fate of being colonized like their neighbors in China. This mission, under the slogan Fukoko Kokoke Yohai, enriched the country, strengthened the army, also extended to social and moral reform. Japan wanted to be seen as a civilized nation in the eyes of the West, and this meant re-evaluating and often suppressing many of its traditional customs, including those related to sex. Suddenly, The traditional Japanese views on sexuality were seen through the lens of Victorian morality. In what the West saw, it often found shocking and backward. The casual nudity in public bathhouses, the open sale of shunga, the institution of the pleasure quarters, and the practice of shu-do, all of these were now sources of national embarrassment, seen as stains on the character of a modernizing nation. You can feel the shift in the streets. The government begins to crack down in earnest. Shunga production is driven deep underground, its artists and publishers facing real legal jeopardy. It transforms from a mainstream art form into a hidden, shameful secret. The public bathhouses begin to enforce gender segregation. The old, earthy openness is replaced by a new sense of modesty and bodily shame, imported alongside Western suits and ballroom dancing. Yoshiwara and the other pleasure quarters face a new kind of scrutiny. The Western powers were appalled by the system of licensed prostitution and indentured servitude. In response, the new Meiji government passed laws, such as the Emancipation Edict for Prostitutes in 1872, which officially freed the women from their contracts and abolished their debts. However, the reality was far more complicated. Many women, with no other skills or family to return to, had little choice but to continue in the same profession, now under the control of private brothel owners in a less regulated and often more exploitative system. Yoshiwara didn't disappear, it just went from being a state-sanctioned institution to a more modern, and often grimmer, red light district. The fate of shu-do is particularly telling. In the new, Western-style National Army and school system, there was no place for such relationships. The Meiji government, influenced by European legal codes, officially outlawed sodomy. The noble way of the youth, once celebrated as a cornerstone of samurai loyalty, was now redefined as a perversion, a crime. The practice was quickly and thoroughly suppressed, driven from the public sphere and into the realm of the private and the forbidden. A fascinating and poignant detail of this transition is the changing hairstyles. The samurai topknot, the chanmage, was seen as a symbol of feudalism and was abandoned, often by government decree, in favor of Western-style haircuts. The shaving of the wakashu for locks, once a profound rite of passage, became meaningless overnight. These changes in appearance were powerful symbols of a deeper transformation in identity and values. Historians are still untangling the complex legacy of this period. The Meiji Restoration is often celebrated as a remarkable success story of rapid modernization, but this success came at a cost. The civilizing mission involved the deliberate suppression of many aspects of Japan's own rich and complex cultural history. The debate centers on how we should view this change. Was it a necessary, if painful, step toward becoming a modern nation-state, or was it a tragic act of cultural self-erasure, a capitulation to foreign moral standards that erased centuries of unique social development? This clash of civilizations created a kind of cultural schizophrenia that Japan still grapples with today. On one hand, there is the public face of Japan, orderly, polite, and reserved. On the other hand, there is a private world where many of the old sensibilities persist, often in new and transmuted forms. The explicit and often bizarre nature of some modern Japanese manga and anime, for example, is seen by some cultural critics as a distant echo of the uninhibited energy of shunga. As you stand in this rapidly changing city, now being rebuilt with brick buildings and gas lamps, you feel a sense of profound loss. The world you have journeyed through with its strange contradictions, its beauty, its cruelty, its humor is fading like a woodblock print left out in the sun. The wind of progress is blowing, and it is sweeping away the floating world, the way of the youth, and the frank, earthy sensuality that once defined a nation. A new set of rules is being written, and the old ways are becoming a story, a piece of a boring history to be whispered about in the quiet of the night. Your long night in the past is coming to an end. The faint light of a new dawn, the dawn of modern Japan, filters through the paper screens. The city of Edo is gone, replaced by the bustling, westernizing metropolis of Tokyo. The figures that populated your journey, the stoic samurai, the glamorous So-Iran, the beautiful Wakashu, the laughing merchant have all receded, becoming ghosts of a bygone era. All that remains are the echoes of their world, faint but persistent. In the culture of the present day, you find yourself standing on a modern Tokyo street corner, perhaps in Asakusa, not far from where the Yoshiwara district once stood. The world is a cacophony of sounds and sights that would have been unimaginable to the people you've met. The roar of cars, the chime of a subway station, the dazzling glare of neon signs. Yet, if you look closely, you can still find traces of the world you left behind. The deep-seated cultural emphasis on separating one's public state from one's true feelings. Hanni is, in many ways, a direct descendant of the samurai's need to separate his public duty from his private desires. The idea that different rules apply in different contexts, the formal world of the office versus the relaxed world of the after-hours drinking party, is a modern expression of the old complexities you witnessed. The samurai's two swords are gone, but the two worlds he inhabited remain. The legacy of the floating world is everywhere, though often in disguise. The modern Japanese obsession with celebrity culture, the idol phenomenon, the intense fandom surrounding manga artists and voice actors, all of this echoes the old adulation for kabuki stars and star courtesans. The water trade Mizushoba, the modern nightlife and entertainment industry with its hostess clubs and host bars, is a direct, if less glamorous, descendant of Yoshiwara's tea houses. The core concept paying for stylized, non-sexual in the case of hostess clubs, female companionship is a modern iteration of an old theme. Even the aesthetics of shunga have a strange afterlife. Some scholars argue that the visual language of modern manga and anime, with its expressive lines, its focus on characters, and its sometimes outlandish depictions of anatomy and emotion, owes a debt to the ukiyo-e tradition, including its most explicit branch. The uninhibited visual imagination of the Edo period didn't disappear, it just found a new medium. The story of Shudo, once so thoroughly suppressed, has also left a faint, complex echo. The modern genre of boys, love yoi or BL manga and anime, created primarily by and for women, often features idealized, romantic, and sometimes tragic relationships between beautiful young men. While culturally a world away from the samurai practice of shudo, some critics see a thematic resonance, the focus on ephemeral beauty, intense emotional bonds between men, and a separation from mainstream heterosexual norms. It's a highly contested connection, with many scholars arguing they are entirely separate phenomena, but the visual and thematic parallels are intriguing. This is one of those areas where historians and cultural critics are still passionately debating the threads of continuity. What, then, is the ultimate legacy of this complex history? It's a story of contradiction. Feudal Japan was a society that was, at once, incredibly repressive and surprisingly permissive. It was a culture that demanded rigid public conformity while allowing for a vibrant, and often wild, private life. It strictly controlled women's lives in the name of family honor while celebrating female beauty and artistry in the floating world. It idealized a noble, heterastic love between warriors, while expecting those same warriors to marry and produce heirs. Understanding this past doesn't mean judging it by today's standards. It means recognizing that every society has its own unique and often bewildering logic. The people of Edo Japan were not better or worse than us. They were simply navigating a different set of rules, pressures, and possibilities. Their world was built on a series of carefully managed hypocrisy, a delicate balance of honor and desire, duty and pleasure. Your journey is over. You have walked the streets of Edo, peeked behind its paper screens, and listened to its secret stories. You've seen that the truth of what sex was really like is not one simple story, but a mosaic of many political, tragic, commercial, humorous, and artistic The past is not a foreign country, it's just a room in the house we all live in. A room we can visit whenever we dim the lights and decide to listen to its echoes. The city sounds around you begin to fade now, the neon lights blurring into a soft, gentle glow. The hard edges of the modern world soften and dissolve, and you feel yourself drifting, floating on a quiet stream. The journey is done, and the noise of history gives way to a deep, peaceful silence. You are no longer an observer, no longer a traveler in time. You are simply here, in this quiet moment, at the edge of sleep. The stories have been told. The figures of the past have bowed and taken their leave, returning to the ink and paper from whence they came. Let their world recede like the tide going out, leaving only the smooth, clean end of your own quiet mind. There is nothing left to analyze, nothing left to understand. There is only the gentle rhythm of your own breathing, a soft and steady anchor in the peaceful dark. You can feel the weight of the day lifting from your shoulders, replaced by a light, comfortable ease. You are safe. You are warm. And you are ready for rest. The final paper screen slides shut, not on a scene from the past, but on the world itself, leaving you in the serene, empty space of your own impending dreams. Let the last thoughts drift away like cherry blossom petals on a gentle breeze. It's time to sleep. It's time to dream.